What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.
Good afternoon. Can I welcome members to the Chamber this afternoon? And we're going to begin, as usual, with Time for Reflection. Our Time for Reflection leaders today are Mia Fallon and Nathaniel Sweeney, and they are from the Living on £2 campaign project representatives from St Aidan's High School in Wishaw. So I'm going to hand over now to Mia and Nathaniel.
Hello everyone, my name is Nathaniel Sweeney. I'm from St Aidan's High School in Wishaw, and I'm here with my friend Mia Fallon to discuss my school's £2 a day challenge. To briefly summarise, the challenge was proposed by Mr O'Donnell, our Head of Social Subjects, to go through a school week with only £10 to spend on food, raising awareness for the 1/3 of the world's population that must live on less than $2 a day. Each student that participated was asked to find sponsors who could donate any amount of money to the charity. I myself asked my parents and close relatives, who then asked other family members, and through a chain reaction, I garnered over £275. However, other students took more creative methods, posting on sites like Instagram and Snapchat to help spread the word further. In total, our school raised £1,311, a great amount for a challenge that originally was just intended to raise awareness about poverty and the frightening position millions of families around the world are facing.
Before beginning the challenge, I don't think anyone had comprehended the obstacles we would face throughout the week and just how little money we could spend. During the week, preparing and budgeting was difficult for many of us, as we had to go to several shops for best priced foods, and I had similar boring meals across the day. The link between poverty and obesity from the challenge became clear, as the cheapest foods tended to contain little nutritional benefits, many of them coming from cans or packets and lacking fresh fruits and vegetables due to insane prices. By the middle of the week, we had small meals very infrequently, leading us to being hungry throughout the day with no money to buy snacks. This affected our mindsets and concentration levels in our work. Many of us were exhausted and were not motivated to complete anything. Reflecting on this past week, it's become apparent that this is what a third of the world endure every day. I've lost all self-pity for myself, becoming instantly more thankful and appreciative for everything I have in life. We intend to donate all the money to local charities, including Paul's Partials, a voluntary group striving to eradicate food poverty in Shotts.
Mia and Nathaniel, thank you very much indeed for your contribution. Thank you very much, colleagues. We're going to move on now to our next item of business, which is consideration of business motion 24273 in the name of Graeme Day on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a revision to this week's business. Could I call on the Minister to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 24273 be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. The next item of business is topical questions. Our first question today is from Alison Johnstone.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the detection of the so-called Brazilian variant of COVID-19 in Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
3 cases of the COVID-19 variant of concern, first identified in Japan but associated with Manaus in Brazil, have been identified in Scotland. These relate to 3 individuals who travelled from Brazil to Aberdeen via Paris and London. As you would expect, contact tracing has been undertaken, close contacts followed up and offered testing as usual, and in an additional precautionary step, the close contacts of these contacts have been identified and followed up. This additional step is being undertaken to ensure that all possible precautions are underway. Passengers on the Heathrow to Aberdeen flight on the afternoon of the 29th of January, that is flight BA1312, are being contacted. However, because not all the data we've received about the passengers is correct, we are asking that anyone on that flight who did not provide up-to-date contact details should call NHS National Contact Tracing Centre on 0800 030 8012. There is no evidence currently of community transmission, but this is of course being closely monitored by Public Health Scotland and the Public Health team at NHS Grampian, with our national clinical advisors in close contact with both. The variant is of concern in terms of both the possibility that it is more contagious than the current dominant COVID-19 strain in Scotland and how it responds to the current vaccines. The extensive and detailed work to reach a confirmed expert view on both aspects here continues.
Thank you. Alison Johnstone.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that the Brazilian variant has now been found in 15 countries that aren't on the UK Government's red list. Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that current border restrictions cannot adequately protect people in Scotland from this concerning strain of COVID-19?
Cabinet Secretary.
I absolutely do, as does the Scottish Government, which is why we want to see much tougher protections on our international borders around the whole of the UK for all international travellers. As Ms Johnson rightly says, it is detected in other countries that are not currently on that red list. And it is important to recognise that whilst we have an advanced genomic sequencing capacity here in Scotland and in the rest of the UK, that is not the case necessarily in countries around the globe, and so it is difficult for them to know if they have any particular variant, which makes it then difficult globally for that to be understood. One of the key ways it can be understood, and therefore citizens here and elsewhere protected, is to have that managed isolation system and the testing that is part of that, which can then be genomically sequenced and variants can be identified. As she knows, the point of the virus, the point of all viruses, is to mutate whenever given the opportunity, and it is those mutations that we need to be able to identify quickly and then act to protect our citizens against.
Alison Johnstone.
Thank you. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise what proportion of samples are currently being sequenced to detect strains of concern? And does Scotland have access to an adequate proportion of UK capacity? And what action is the Scottish Government taking to increase genome sequencing capacity in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
So, genomic sequencing is carried out by the COG UK partnership, as it is known, which has 2 partner organisations in Scotland, and by NHS Scotland's sequencing service. A representative number of positive PCR samples in Scotland are genomically sequenced. That can be increased when we have situations like this, where a variant is identified. That percentage is usually in normal times around 4 to 5%, but as I say, that can be increased. Additional testing and sequencing provisions are in place for people returning from travel abroad. But as recently as yesterday, I had a further conversation with our Chief Medical Officer, who will pursue the option of further increasing our capacity here in Scotland in terms of genomic sequencing, because as we look ahead, we can undoubtedly see alongside our increased testing capacity the additional precautionary and protective steps that further genomic sequencing on the basis of an increased sampling of positive PCR tests might give us further protection measures.
Thank you. Gillian Martin, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Reading about the circumstances surrounding the 3 people from the North East who came back from Brazil with a new strain, I've got concerns over the risks of bringing in new strains from those travelling via airport hubs in countries not deemed to be high risk at the moment, but starting their journeys from high-risk areas. People not being required to quarantine at their first entry into the UK to stop the spreading of infection as they make their way to their final destination. And given that new strains can take time to be identified, isn't it time that the UK Government follow Scotland and adopt the same policy of quarantine from every country, not just those deemed high risk at a certain point? And I'd be interested to hear what conversations have been had with the UK Government on all those points.
Cabinet Secretary.
So I completely agree with all the points that Ms Martin is making, and I think this instance simply exemplifies why our approach as a Scottish Government, requiring much tighter controls in all our international borders, is so important. And she is right that the ideal and the correct position, and the one that we continue to press the UK Government on, is that at the very least, passengers whose final destination is Scotland should be required to quarantine at the first point of entry and not then come through any of those hubs south of the border and then travel to Scotland, because that obviously creates a gap in all the protective measures that we need to put in place. My colleague, Mr Matheson, has these conversations regularly with his counterpart. I know that the First Minister has raised it on certainly more than one occasion, and at the regular 4 Nations Health Ministers meetings that I have, at least weekly at the moment, I do raise that, and I know that my colleagues elsewhere share those concerns, and particularly around, even if you stick with the red list, how quickly it is possible, and the answer to that is not very quickly, how quickly it is possible to identify countries that should enter into that red list or not. So the more straightforward way and the more protective way to undertake this approach and make sure that we can guard against inward transmission in a better and more proportionate way than is currently the case is to say that all international arrivals, with the exemptions that are already there, all international arrivals should have to enter managed quarantine.
Thank you. And Jackie Bailey.
The concerns about the Brazilian variant are that is potentially spreading more easily and it can evade the immune system, leading to reinfections. There are 2 cases of the Brazilian variant of COVID-19 found in South Gloucestershire. They're doing surge testing, including door-to-door testing, for people living in particular postcodes. There are 3 cases in Aberdeen, so I'd be interested to know, what is the Scottish Government doing? We've previously raised the need for using all available testing capacity, so is the Scottish Government testing everybody who is on the plane, and will they use surge testing to stop the spread of this much more infectious virus?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks very much, and can I welcome Ms Bailey to her new portfolio. I look forward to our constructive engagement in the remaining weeks. In terms of her particular question, what we are doing around those cases in Aberdeen is targeted testing. So let me take that in steps. Two of the individuals who were from those 3 cases required a level of hospital treatment. All those staff who were in contact with those individuals have been tested, in addition to the regular testing, of course, that our NHS staff undergo. There is a connection with a local school, again, testing for those involved there, as well as testing offered to close contacts where they have been experiencing symptoms, and to those passengers on that Heathrow to Aberdeen flight who we are contacting, including the crew, where testing is offered should they be experiencing any symptoms, remembering the time lag between the date of that flight and now. So that is the basis on which that work is being undertaken. My understanding of what is happening from Public Health England potentially relates to a later flight that entered from Brazil via Zurich, I think, in this instance, where surge testing, because of the nature of the cases there, which had not initially isolated in the way that ours did, makes, I can understand the sense of that. But the decision around testing and how it is used is, of course, clinically led by our experts in public health.
Thank you very much. Question number 2, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will publish the legal advice that it received regarding the judicial review into the handling of harassment complaints against the former First Minister, Alex Salmond.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, the maintenance of legal professional privilege is routine and is an essential part of good government. No administration since devolution has disclosed legal advice in the context of litigation, and I have expressed my concern about setting a precedent that could hamper future administrations in receiving candid legal advice. The Government has taken unprecedented steps to share with the Committee in confidence a summary of the legal advice it received during the judicial review, supplemented by oral evidence by the Lord Advocate. However, over recent days, a number of accusations have been raised which, if not responded to, could undermine confidence in the Parliament, the Government and our independent justice system. In light of these developments, I have concluded, in line with the terms of Section 2.40 of the Scottish Ministerial Code, that the balance of public interest in these exceptional circumstances now lies in releasing to the Committee and for publication the contents of legal advice received by the Government during the judicial review, in particular the advice from external counsel. The law officers have provided their consent that there are compelling reasons for disclosure in these specific circumstances. Subject to the completion of the necessary legal notifications, we aim to release the material to the Committee this afternoon. In order to address the desire for this information to be available as soon as possible, we have focused on providing information that charts the development of the judicial review and specifically the changes in prospects that emerged during that process.
Murdo Fraser.
Presiding Officer, this episode just demonstrates the contempt that this Government holds for the Scottish Parliament. For months, the Committee has been calling for publication of the legal advice. There have been 2 votes in Parliament last year calling for it to be published. And only now, at the very last moment, when a metaphorical gun is held to the head of the Deputy First Minister and he is threatened with a vote of no confidence, does he finally agree to release some legal advice at the very last possible moment. Presiding Officer, we have not yet seen the documents Mr Swinney refers to. However, last night, Mr Salmond's lawyers told us the material that the Scottish Government were proposing to release was, in their words, highly selective and based on what will cause the least embarrassment to the Government. So can the Deputy First Minister assure us that the requests from the Committee for publication of all relevant documents will be met, or will he continue to cover up the truth?
Cabinet Secretary Mr Swinney.
Presiding Officer, first of all, can I say that when, if I heard Mr Fraser correctly, and I may have misheard him, and if I do, I will apologise, but I think he said that a gun had been metaphorically held to my head. Now, I don't think, Presiding Officer, that's appropriate terminology for one Member of Parliament to use to another. Neither, Presiding Officer, did I think it was appropriate that some other Conservative MSPs expressed in some language which I think is wholly inappropriate for one human being to express to another, to be expressed from one Member of Parliament to another. So I'll simply say that to get that off my chest. The second point is that Mr Fraser, as well as being a Member of Parliament, is also a trained solicitor. He knows the importance, from his professional background, of the principle of legal professional privilege. He knows how central it is to the foundations of the Scottish legal system and the relationship between clients and advisers. And for government, in litigation, that is central. So the government has wrestled with that difficult issue, and we have concluded that in the public interest it is right to act in the way that we are now acting. Finally, Mr Fraser has raised comments made by the solicitors for the former First Minister. I would simply encourage Mr Fraser to wait till he sees the information that we publish, and then I'm sure he can apply the usual independent judgment with which we normally associate with Mr Fraser to the material that he sees before him.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think, frankly, we can do without Mr Swinney's manufactured outrage in this matter. He and his government have behaved disgracefully in this whole affair, and he should be apologising to the Chamber for his conduct throughout this whole episode. But, Presiding Officer, the legal advice we are now being offered will not be made available to the committee before the First Minister comes to give us evidence at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. How does the Deputy First Minister propose the members of the committee will be able to pursue questions that might arise from the legal advice with the First Minister, or indeed anybody else in this government, given it has been produced to us so late in the day?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the information will be available later on this afternoon, so unless Mr Fraser goes to his bed at 5 o'clock, he can read it tonight.
Neil Findlay.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Friday's evidence session was extraordinary, to say the least, and threw up many questions. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary can answer this. Which of these are the most serious? A failure to declare a £950 campaign donation, a muddle over an office sublet, or withholding up to 40 documents that have been requested by the police under a search warrant?
Well, it's not for me to offer legal advice across the Parliamentary Chamber. What's important is that the Government has fulfilled its obligations in providing information to this committee, and we will complete that task this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr Swinney. We're going to move on to the next item of business, which is a statement from the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, on COVID-19. The First Minister, as always, will take questions following her statement. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak button, and I call on the First Minister.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Last week I updated Parliament on the Scottish Government's strategic framework. When I update Parliament next week, I hope to be able to confirm some changes to the Level 4 restrictions between now and then, and in light of the positive data that I will report on today, we will be considering if it might be possible to accelerate the exit from lockdown in any way, consistent, of course, with the care and caution that we know continues to be necessary. Later today, the Public Health Minister will support the resumption of competitive football in Scottish Leagues 1 and 2, the Scottish Women's Premier League 1, and for the purposes of playing Scottish Cup ties, certain Highland League teams. And I hope this news will be welcomed by football fans across the country. The focus of my statement today, though, is education. In particular, I'll update Parliament on plans to get all children back to school on a full-time basis as soon as possible. First, though, I'll give a brief summary of today's statistics. The total number of positive cases reported yesterday was 542. That's 4.4% of tests carried out, and the total number of cases is now 203,012. 784 people are now in hospital, 40 fewer than yesterday. 71 are in intensive care, which is the same as yesterday. I'm sorry to say, though, that in the past 24 hours, a further 33 deaths have been registered, and the total number of deaths under the daily measurement is now 7,164. And again, I want to send my condolences to everyone who has lost a loved one. Yesterday, of course, we marked the anniversary of the first case of COVID being confirmed in Scotland. The Scottish Government is currently talking to health charities and family organisations about how we intend to remember all those who have lost their lives and also mark the many sacrifices that people have made, and we intend to say more about this soon. I'll also give a short update on the vaccination programme. As of 8:30 this morning, 1,634,361 people have received a first dose of the vaccine. That's an increase of 22,783 since yesterday. There is, of course, good and increasing evidence that vaccination is already reducing the number of deaths, particularly in care homes. In time, as a growing proportion of the population gains protection through vaccination, it should also start to have an impact on hospitalisations and on transmission rates. There was further positive news yesterday with the report from Public Health England that a first dose of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine reduces the chance of needing hospital treatment by more than 80%. And of course, that confirms research published last week in Scotland by the University of Edinburgh. We remain on course to offer the first dose to everyone over 50, all unpaid carers and all adults with an underlying health condition by mid-April. We may face some supply issues next week, we understand, which could affect appointments, but we're working hard to try to avoid that. And I want to stress that these issues will not affect the mid-April target. In addition to the progress on vaccination, we're making good progress at suppressing the virus. I said last week that the decline in case numbers had appeared to slow down and that this was a concern. However, I'm pleased to report this week that recent data, or more recent data, has been much more encouraging, and it strongly suggests that cases are still declining. This time last week, we were recording an average of 815 new cases a day, and that has now fallen to 657 new cases a day on average, and this is the lowest level since the first week of October last year. The average test positivity rate has also fallen and is now below 5%. Hospital admissions are also falling. In the first half of January, more than 1,000 COVID patients a week were being admitted to hospital. In the week up to 23rd February, that had fallen to 468, and the number in intensive care has also continued to decline. So the sacrifices that everyone is making are undoubtedly having an impact. Collectively, we are suppressing the virus and lives are being saved as a result. There is, I think, more reason to be optimistic now than perhaps at any time since early autumn last year. That said, we know we need to take care to avoid sending progress into reverse. 657 new cases a day might be the lowest level for 5 months, but it is still 13 times higher than the numbers being recorded in mid-August. The reduction in hospital admissions is very encouraging, but hundreds of people every week are still falling seriously ill. And we know that the new variant, which now accounts for more than 85% of new cases, is highly infectious. And of course, we have been reminded over the weekend of the significant risk we now face of other new variants, such as the P1 Brazilian variant, being imported into the country. So the news on vaccines and on suppression is overwhelmingly positive. But we must be sensible, and this can be harder to do when things appear to be going in the right direction. But we must continue to be sensible in the decisions we take over the next few weeks if we want to make sure that we keep going in the right direction. And that provides context for the decisions that we have taken this week, and Cabinet confirmed this morning, about our next steps in enabling children to return to school. Those decisions follow consultation with COSLA and local authorities, discussions with the Education Recovery Group and scientific advice from the Advisory Subgroup on Education and Children's Issues, and that advice will be published tomorrow. Children in primaries 1 to 3 are of course already back at school full-time. We continue to monitor the impacts of that, although it is too early to be certain. And some secondary school students have also returned to take part in essential practical work for national qualifications. And childcare and early education premises are also now open for children below school age. The next phase of reopening education will take place on March the 15th. And I can confirm today that from that date, 15th March, unless new evidence or new circumstances force us to reconsider, which we of course hope will not be the case, all children in primary 4 to 7 will go back to school on a full-time basis. All primary school children will also be able to return to regulated childcare, including after-school and breakfast clubs. We'll also take the next steps in a phased return to secondary school from 15th March with a clear expectation that all secondary school pupils will be back in school on a full-time basis following the Easter holidays. However, it is the intention that all secondary school pupils will return to spend some time in school from 15th March until the Easter break. Students in the senior phase of secondary school, that's of course years 4 to 6, who are taking national qualifications will have priority for face-to-face lessons in school. This will ensure that they can have their hard work fairly recognised with qualifications under the alternative certification model. However, although years 4 to 6 may have priority, we expect that all children in secondary school will receive some in-school education each week up until the Easter break and then return full-time following that. This will allow pupils to get used to being back in school and allow them to start seeing friends again. And I'm sure everyone will agree that this is important for the well-being of young people as well as for education. Before Easter, of course, since this will be a blended learning model, we will also continue to ensure that remote learning is of the highest standard possible. Reports from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Education have shown that the delivery of remote learning has improved greatly between the first and second lockdowns, and I'm immensely grateful to all of the teachers and other education professionals who've done so much to build on the experience of the first lockdown. We'll work with Education Scotland to ensure that enhanced online resources continue to be available over the coming month, and we will work with local authorities to support young people's well-being in other ways, for example by providing more opportunities for outdoor learning. Education Scotland will publish guidance for local authorities on the phased return over the next few days, and local authorities will have flexibility in how they implement the phased return to allow them to take account of local factors in deciding how to make the return as safe as possible. But we want to ensure that they are able to maximise the number of time that secondary school pupils can safely spend in school in the period up to the Easter holidays. Obviously, we recognise that the safety of staff and children must continue to be a key priority. All local authorities, therefore, will, at least until the Easter break, and indeed this is one of the limitations, continue to observe the current requirement for 2-metre physical distancing in secondary schools. And when secondary schools return, face coverings will need to be worn at all times. The Advisory Group on Education and Children's Issues has also noted the continuing importance of good ventilation. We provided local authorities with £375 million of education recovery funding to date, and many councils are using some of this funding to monitor and improve ventilation in schools. In addition, we'll continue to offer twice-weekly lateral flow testing for all school staff in primary, secondary and special schools and all secondary school pupils in years 4, 5 and 6. And I would encourage as many staff and senior phase pupils as possible to use the tests when they return. It's a further important way to ensure that schools remain as safe as possible. The final point I want to make on schools is simply to say thank you, firstly, to all school leadership teams and all school staff, including, of course, all teachers, for everything that has been done to support children and young people in the last few months. I know everyone is looking forward to having children back in the classroom as soon as possible. I also want to thank parents across the country. I can only imagine how difficult all of this disruption continues to be, but I hope and I believe that the end of it is now firmly in sight. And my thanks too to children and young people. I know how hard it must be to be separated from friends and teachers, but you have all responded magnificently to all of the difficulties of the past year, and I hope you're looking forward to getting back to school later this month. And I hope that you will also start to feel life become a lot more normal very soon. The phased approach we're taking to school return can and will be frustrating, I know that, but it is necessary and it is firmly based on the expert advice that we've received. It is the best and also the most sustainable and enduring way to get as many children back to school as possible, as safely as possible. Now, there's one other issue I want to briefly highlight today. I can confirm that we are clarifying guidance on an issue that is directly relevant to parents of newborn children. There are currently a number of essential purposes, for example, essential care, which enable us to go into someone else's house right now. We are amending guidance on this today to make it clear that those essential purposes include support for the welfare and well-being of a parent of a child under the age of 1. And I hope that gives clarity and enables vital support for parents of very young children. Presiding Officer, as we come out of this lockdown, hopefully the last lockdown, we are prioritising, as we said we would, the education and well-being of our children. In addition, although we remain cautious, as we have to be in the face of a dangerous and highly infectious virus, I hope that people will take heart from the data I have reported. It shows real, significant and sustained progress in getting the virus back under control. Next week, I hope to confirm to Parliament the other changes to the Level 4 restrictions that will take effect from the 15th March. And then the week after that, I'm scheduled to set out a firmer timetable for the period after 26 April. As I said at the outset, indeed as I said last week, we will consider between now and then if the data allows us to bring forward any relaxation of the rules. I've always said if we can go further and faster, then we will not hesitate to do so. All of us want to move on as quickly as possible and as a priority to see friends and family again, and that will very much be the focus of our considerations over the next week, and I hope the day for that is now not too far away. But to make sure we don't see any reverse in our progress that would put that in jeopardy, it's really important that for now we all abide by the lockdown rules. So please continue to stick to their letter and their spirit. Stay at home except for essential purposes. Don't meet people from other households indoors. Follow the facts advice when you're out and about. Work from home if you can. And if you're an employer, please continue to support your workers to do so. If we do all of this, we can and we will make it easier for children to return to school and for all of us to return to more normality soon. We'll protect ourselves, our communities and our NHS, and we'll keep the virus under control while vaccinations do their work. So for the moment, please continue to stick with it, stick together and stay at home.
Thank you very much, First Minister. We'll move now to questions. Our first question from Ruth Davison.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thanks to the First Minister for advance notice of her statement. May I also take this first parliamentary opportunity to welcome Anas Sarwar to his new role as Labour leader. It's the 5th time I've been able to do that in my time here, but I truly wish him well, and I extend all officers to work together constructively when it's in Scotland's interest to do so in the weeks ahead, even if it is only weeks that I have. Presiding Officer, the news this week that the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine can reduce hospital admissions by 80% after one dose is welcome indeed. The fact that infection rates, hospitalisation rates and fatalities are all down significantly should be of huge reassurance to us all. This week was also a week of milestones, with more than 20 million people across the UK and 1.5 million across Scotland receiving their first vaccination. Vaccinations, of course, don't just help those receiving the jab, they help us all. And with just over a quarter of adults in Edinburgh now having been vaccinated, up to nearly half in Dumfries and Galloway, the trend is clear. The greater the rollout, the greater reduction in case numbers and the severity of cases. So it is right that the Scottish Government reconsiders its reopening plan for the country with respect to the improved results that we are seeing. And I welcome that Scottish Conservative calls for an earlier return to school for many pupils have been listened to. And while it is hugely welcome to young people's mental health and well-being, their social development and their educational attainment, getting all pupils to return while still observing COVID rules does pose some logistical questions. Face coverings and social distancing are now concepts we take for granted in so many areas of our lives, but teachers and head teachers are rightly asking what support they will receive if their school estate doesn't allow for the 2-metre social distancing in classroom that the government requires of secondary schools. If you can't fit all pupils into their usual classroom with the 2-metre rule, and if you've no extra classrooms or staff to man the split or composite classes created, what support and solutions are going to be made available for them?
First Minister.
Well, all of the developments that I narrated earlier on and have just been reiterated are really welcome. I don't want to overstate this because I don't think it's fair to people. I've tried not to give people false promises on this, but I do think we have every reason now to believe that the exit from lockdown might be quicker and come sooner than we believed would be the case just a few weeks ago. But we know that the worst thing we could do, and what would make that less likely, is if we move too quickly right now and jeopardise the situation that is now beginning to emerge in such a positive way. So that's why we need to be careful, and that caution, as well as a determination to get children back to normal, lies behind the decisions that I've outlined today on schools. We continue to work with schools to make sure that while it is not possible to have all young people back to school as normal, there is a good provision of remote learning for the period between now and Easter. Then there will be a blended learning approach for secondary schools, and we continue to work with schools and local authorities to make sure that that is of the quality that young people and their parents expect. We've given local authorities significant funding to help with practical arrangements in schools. I mentioned ventilation in my opening remarks, but that will cover a range of other things. But key to this, as it was last August when we managed to support the full-time return of school for all pupils and keep schools open virtually for the remainder of last year. The key is to get the virus as low as possible so that as much normality in schools becomes possible and some of the restrictions can be eased, which allows that normality to open up. The additional factor we have now, which we didn't have last August, of course, is what we hope will be the suppressive effect of the vaccine. So these are things we monitor on an ongoing basis, take advice and work with local authorities and schools to facilitate. But I hope that by the time we are coming out of the Easter break, we have further progress that allows much greater normality in our schools than has been possible up until now.
Thank you. Question 2 from Anas Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I thank Ruth Davidson for her very kind comments, and I look forward in a matter of weeks to welcoming my second Conservative leader perhaps in my third Conservative leader in my short spell as Labour leader. Can I thank the FM for advance sight of her statement, and can I extend my condolences to all those who have lost loved ones. This has been a difficult year for us all, and our thoughts and condolences go out to all those that have lost a loved one. As the First Minister said, it is 12 months since the first COVID-19 case was identified in Scotland. And in that time, we have seen our frontline workers, our NHS staff, our social care staff and all our frontline workers continue to go above and beyond, and our heartfelt thanks to every single one of them and their families. The vaccine rollout is the light at the end of the tunnel, and it's great to see the evidence of its efficacy giving us all hope. But as lockdown restrictions begin to lift, I do urge the Scottish Government to also focus on our recovery, and I will support all efforts by the Government to bring our communities together and to rebuild our nation. That must be our collective priority for everyone across this Parliament. Presiding Officer, parents across the country are worried about their child's education and their child's mental health. Can the First Minister therefore confirm when our Government will set out details of a national recovery plan for Scotland's pupils and our education system? Figures published today on child and adolescent mental health services show that more than 1,500 children are on waiting lists already waited more than a year to be seen by a specialist. More than 1,500 children. And the last quarter, 25%, 1 in 4 children, had their referral rejected. What more can the Scottish Government do to give support to children who need it right now, particularly in crisis services? And finally, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has a target of 400,000 vaccinations a week, a target that I have welcomed and that I support. But the numbers from the last week in February show an average of around 29,000 vaccinations per day, and yesterday fewer than 23,000 people were vaccinated. And today the First Minister has suggested that already there's a potential of slowing vaccination rates going forward even further. When will we have that target met of 400,000 vaccinations a week so we can collectively get out of this crisis?
First Minister.
Well, can I also take the opportunity to welcome Anas Sarwar to his place? I don't want to brag here, and I'd have to count, but I think I'm probably well above 5 when it comes to Labour leaders that I've faced across this chamber. Can I say, in all seriousness, there is also a historic nature to Anas Sarwar's election as leader of the Scottish Labour Party, and I think it speaks well of the diversity of our country. So for that reason, if for no other reason, I wish him well in the job. It also proves one other thing, because Anas and I will not just face off across the chamber as respective leaders of our parties. Of course, we are opponents in the constituency of Glasgow Southside. So I think we've just proven again over the last few days that Glasgow Southside is actually the centre of the universe, which I know everybody in the chamber will agree with as much as Anas and I do. But I wish him... I was going to say I wish him all the best. I wish him a modicum degree of success in the weeks ahead. On the questions he has asked me, in terms of a national recovery plan for education, the work to support recovery in education is already underway. The funding I've set out, the steps that we are supporting with local authorities, so provision, for example, of tutoring support through eSchool, the money we've made available for additional teachers, the extra funding for local authorities that they can use flexibly based on what they consider is the most appropriate way, and we will keep that under review. I have said, Deputy First Minister has said, supporting children to come through and to catch up, not just educationally, but in a whole range of ways from the experience of the last year, will be a long-term project. Similarly, on mental health, we've already published a mental health recovery plan. The Mental Health Minister will continue to keep Parliament updated. Before the pandemic, transforming and redesigning the provision of child and adolescent mental health services was a priority. So one of the things we had already made real progress on was mental health counsellors available for all secondary schools. That work needs to pick up and be intensified as a result of the experience of the pandemic. Finally, on vaccination, we exceeded the 400,000 a week when we had the supplies to do it. So the constraining factor right now, which is not within our control, is supply. The dip in daily vaccination rates in the last couple of weeks, which we flagged in advance, was entirely down to supply. If you look at numbers across the 4 nations, you will see that same dip. We expect that there might be another dip in supply next week. We don't expect that to affect the mid-April targets. But we're in a position now, I'm not complacent about this, it takes a lot of work by a lot of people across the entire country. We're in a position now to be able to go as fast as we have supplies to vaccinate people. The constraining factor is the supplies, and that is why we continue to talk regularly to the pharmaceutical companies to get as long-term a line of sight on their manufacturing and supply prospects as we can. But we'll vaccinate people just as fast as we have the vaccine to do it.
Thank you. Alison Johnstone, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, and may I too welcome Anna Sarwar to his new role as Labour leader. The Scottish Greens have long called for action to be taken to make our schools safe, particularly for regular testing for staff and senior pupils. Parliament voted in support of our proposals before Christmas, and I welcome that they've finally been delivered. Another proposal that we and the EIS have made is that teachers and school staff be vaccinated, be prioritised for vaccination. So far, this has only been accepted for some additional support needs staff, but even this isn't yet being delivered across Scotland as planned. I understand, for example, that special school teachers in Lothian have been turned down for vaccination. So can the First Minister clarify when all ASN staff will be vaccinated, and will her government take action to ensure this is delivered? Thank you.
First Minister.
I'll certainly look into the issue or the claimed issue of a particular problem in Lothian. Directors of Education have been asked to identify staff who fall into this category so that they can have vaccination as quickly as possible. But if there are particular issues, I say this across the chamber, if there are particular issues in particular parts of the country, make sure we are aware of them so that we can immediately go onto them and try to resolve them. And I'll come back, or I'll ask the Health Secretary to come back to Alison Johnstone on that point. More broadly, we are following the advice and the recommendations of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. I think that is the right and the only thing to do. While supplies of vaccine are still constrained to some extent, we have to make choices about who gets vaccinated, and the expert advice is the right way to make those choices. We're following the initial prioritisation plan, which, as I've said before, we will be working to do as quickly as possible, and then we will move into the rest of the population, which the JCVI recommend continues to be done on an age basis. So teachers will be done in line with that priority. And of course, many teachers will already have been vaccinated if they fall in one of the categories that have already had priority. And many will be being vaccinated right now because they will fall within the category of people with underlying health conditions. And of course, we are working to do everybody over the age of 50 by mid-April, which I know is not every teacher, but then we move down the age range to have everybody vaccinated in the adult population by the end of July. But as soon as we start to depart from the expert advice, we start to make choices that are political, not expert-driven. And given the importance and the sensitivity of this, I think it's important that we stick to the clinical advice.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Ruth McGuire.
I welcome the changes for newborn babies. It's something that we on these benches have been arguing for some time. But perhaps it was unwise for the First Minister rather sneer at other governments for making up dates, when the dates that she set last week haven't lasted 7 days. The 3-week review has changed to a weekly review. And I want schools back as soon as possible. But the result of this last-minute change is that there is no guidance ready, and teachers have been left to clear up this issue and make it work. If 2/3 of the class will be at home because of the 2-metre physical distancing, how will teachers juggle the additional workload? There are no more hours in the day. So teachers are exhausted. They've been working incredibly hard with this remote learning. So is this the way to reward them?
Minister.
With the greatest respect, I think Willie Reid, I'll come on to the teacher point directly in a second, but his overall characterisation is just not correct. We have set dates, we are sticking to these dates, but we said last week that if the data allows it, we will accelerate. That is the right and proper way to do it. I said last week that we hoped that from the 15th of March, all primary school children would be back. We had to confirm that today, which I've done. And I think I said last week that we wanted to try to get as many secondary school pupils back as much as possible into school, and we've been working to confirm what I've just confirmed today. I think I said last week that next week I would confirm the other changes that we hope to make on the 15th of March, and then the week after that we would set out more time lines for the period after the 26th of April, which I've just confirmed all of that today. So that hasn't changed. What has changed, which is a good thing, is that the data is slightly more promising than it was when I stood here last week. Last week were looking at a plateauing of cases. That now seems to be back firmly into decline, which allows us to assess whether there are more things we can do earlier than we previously anticipated. That's the way we have always done this, and I think it is the right way to proceed. I have every respect and huge gratitude for what teachers have done over the past year. I don't doubt for a minute that they are exhausted in the way that many people working across many different sectors of our society will be, and we owe them a huge amount. I think most teachers want to see children back in school as quickly as possible. We have to do that in a phased way to make it safe. We listen very carefully to the views of teachers through the EIS, for example, and the Education Recovery Group, and we come to a balanced decision. But I can't imagine there are many people across the country right now who don't think it is right to prioritise the well-being and the education of young people. And I'm not suggesting Willie Rennie is doing that, but we need to be able to take decisions as quickly as we can and to try to get to a maximalist position with young people's education. Yes, that involves us all, and particularly those in the front line of education, having to adapt in order to accommodate that. But that, I think, is better than having a period of time where young people are unnecessarily out of school more than they need to be.
Thank you. Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, I did listen carefully there to the First Minister's response to Alison Johnstone, but I will still raise this issue that's been raised with me locally, as I think it's worth looking at the specifics. And the concern's been raised with me that some classroom assistants who provide close personal care for children with additional support needs are not being included in the vaccination programme. One worker told me that they feel the threshold for vulnerability is too high, and by not being vaccinated that they're putting the child in their care in harm's way. Could the First Minister say a little bit more about how vulnerability and risk is currently being assessed? And I wonder if the guidelines might be looked at to just check that there's not a gap within them. Thank you.
First Minister.
Of course, we're happy to look at the guidance if there is a sense that it is not covering sufficient numbers or categories of people. The guidance on this was issued on the 29th of January. It was shared with Chief Executive of all local authorities and clarified in terms of the inclusion of some education staff in the cohort 2, that staff working closely, very closely with children and young people with most complex additional support needs should be vaccinated with that order of priority. It sets out that staff should be offered the vaccination if they're supporting children and young people with complex healthcare needs requiring coordination and provision of support from education, health or social care services within school settings. Staff who are eligible will be staff who undertake regular healthcare and social care duties with multiple children or young people and moving and handling of them, all of which mean that they often work in very close proximity for prolonged periods of time, providing a range of interventions, including personal and intimate care. The most recent letter from the Chief Medical Officer to health boards issued on the 5th of February, and it included the same detail about how to identify eligible staff. So I think there is clear guidance there, but I'm happy to ask the Health Secretary to look into any particular concerns that Ruth Maguire or any other member might have. And if there's more detail that any member wants to pass to the Health Secretary, I would encourage them to do so.
Thank you. Liam Kerr, to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. No one doubts the strain that COVID-19 has put on services, including within the prison service. Now, last summer, the government took a decision to release several hundred prisoners early as a response to the pandemic, but figures just out show that more than 40% of those released are already back in jail. So I warned at the time that the government needed to put a robust monitoring strategy in place to protect the public. So can I ask, why didn't it? And can the First Minister confirm whether, given the statistics she's just set out, there is any intention to release further prisoners early?
First Minister.
I'll ask the Justice Secretary to write with the details of monitoring that's in place. And I don't mean this flippantly, and I'm certainly happy to look into the detail of this more. But if it is the case that a proportion of prisoners having been released are back, that is not something we should take any pleasure in, of course, but it might suggest that there is actually monitoring of people and appropriate actions are being taken. So if it was the case that nobody was bothering about what prisoners who had been released were doing, then it may be the case that we wouldn't see that. But I'll ask the Justice Secretary to write with more detail. You know, some of what has been done throughout the pandemic has been inescapable. It's not been actions that any government would have wanted to take. All governments across the UK, I suspect many governments across the world, had to do similar things in relation to prisoners. As we face this new, more infectious variant, one of the risks that is already materialising is institutional spread, and that has manifested itself with some prison outbreaks in recent times. So this is not easy, and it is by far over in terms of some of these very vulnerable institutional settings. So some of these decisions that we've had to take in the past may require to be taken in the future as well, as we try to get through this with as limited transmission vulnerability as we possibly can.
Thank you. Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, I know that you're aware that the tourism industry is a crucial part of my Stirling constituency's economy, and that a large part of the sector is made up of small, self-catering guest houses and bed and breakfast operators. For such operators, their business provides their only income, for some of them anyway, and I know some are really struggling financially. Therefore, while some may receive strategic framework grants, can I ask on their behalf that the Scottish Government considers providing a one-off top-up grant to help ease the huge pressure they are under?
First Minister.
Well, tourism is central to the Scottish economy, and I know it's particularly central to constituencies like Bruce Crawford's. While many small accommodation providers will already be receiving support via the Strategic Framework Business Fund, I'm pleased to say that we have also agreed an expansion of a scheme to provide equivalent support to small accommodation providers who pay council tax. That's in recognition of the challenges on an ongoing basis that businesses such as B&Bs, guest houses and self-catering face, and it's intended to ensure that we reach as wide a range of businesses as possible, and there is a plan to release details of this by the end of this week, and beyond that we'll continue to review the support in place and work with businesses to explore all options.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Public Health Scotland statistics showed that teachers have a 47% greater chance of getting COVID than the general population. We all want to get our children back to school as soon as possible, but all teachers and all school support staff need to be safe too, especially if we want to ensure continuity of education. So will the First Minister ensure that all teachers are vaccinated before the 15th of March, given the data from the experts at Public Health Scotland?
First Minister.
I'm not going to get into a debate about the interpretation of the data. There's a range of data about risk of transmission in schools, amongst teachers and amongst young people, and I think it is important not to oversimplify it. Suffice to say, the safety of teachers and everybody working in a school environment is paramount. That is why we are taking a phased approach to the return of schools and not taking the decision to put all secondary school pupils back full-time from the 15th of March, because in our judgment and the judgment of our expert advisors, that would be taking risks that were not appropriate. In terms of the question about vaccination, much as I would dearly love to stand here and agree every request that's made for priority vaccination, if I was to accede to that request, I would be driving a coach and horses through the JCVI expert clinical advice. And we'd be doing that in a way that no other government across the UK is doing. And while we have limited supplies of vaccine, and so we can't vaccinate everybody at once, we have to choose what the prioritisation basis is, and we have to do that on the basis of the best clinical advice. And the clinical advice is, as people know, for the first 1 to 9 cohort groups, and then the advice of the JCVI is to continue to do that based on age. Progressively, many teachers will have been vaccinated already, many will be getting vaccinated over the next couple of weeks, and then those in the younger age groups will be vaccinated as we move to do the whole adult population by the end of July. But every time, and I'm not making this comment particular to teachers, but every time we take somebody who is younger and fitter and therefore less clinically at risk of vaccination of the virus and vaccinate them ahead of somebody who is at more clinical risk, then we're making political choices that is not backed up by the clinical advice.
Thank you. Rona Mackay to be followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister if she can provide an update on the number of care home residents who have received their second dose of the vaccine, and also if the supply of vaccine is likely to affect this.
First Minister.
So the latest figures we have show that just under 14,500 care home residents have now received their second dose, which is roughly 48% of residents in care homes for older people have completed the 2-dose schedule. We're now publishing weekly statistics on supply on the Scottish Government website, so people will also have transparency about the supply that is available. Obviously, we prioritise care homes. We prioritise them not just in the sense they were the first group that we vaccinated, but we spent a lot, or the vaccinators on our behalf, spent a lot of time and effort maximising the uptake of vaccine in care homes, and I think we are starting to see the benefit of that, given that the sharpest falls in mortality due to COVID have been in care homes as the vaccine starts to have its effect. So completing the second doses as quickly as possible will give residents and staff working in care homes an added layer of reassurance.
Thank you. Donald Cameron to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Several parents from island communities such as Mull and Isla have contacted me seeking an earlier full-time opening of schools on these islands than currently planned. Has the First Minister given any consideration to this beyond what has just been announced today, given the relatively low levels of COVID-19 cases on these islands? And will the Scottish Government consider the potential for a more general easing of restrictions on our islands in light of their particular circumstances?
First Minister.
Well, if I can point to what I said in my statement, because I think it's got particular relevance to the legitimate question that's been raised. I said that we will issue guidance, or Education Scotland will issue guidance on the phased return of secondary schools later this week. But within that guidance, we want local authorities to have a degree of flexibility in order that they can maximise the number of, or the time that secondary school pupils are spending in school in the period between now and Easter. So what that means is that in smaller authorities, island communities, for example, where there may be very small numbers of pupils going to a particular school, if all of them could be back full-time while the 2 metres distancing continues to be respected, then that's something a local authority should have flexibility over. The position of the government is we want, in the period between now and Easter, for secondary school pupils to have as much time as it is possible to give them physically in school. But that has to be consistent with the safety measures that still require to be in place. So there will be some parts of the country where that involves a greater degree of in-person school education than will be the case in some other parts of the country.
Thank you. John Mason to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you very much. Many people are wanting the schools opened as soon as possible, but some parents and pupils and teachers are nervous about the risks that there might be in school. Can the First Minister offer any reassurance to parents, pupils and teachers in that position about PPE, testing and such like?
First Minister.
The main words of reassurance I want to give again are that we are taking all of these decisions very carefully. My position, and I suspect it's the position of most parents across the country, if not all parents across the country, is if it was safe to get children back into school full-time tomorrow, that's what they would want. But that would not be safe. So we have to do this on a phased basis, and that's the main thing that we're doing to make sure that safety is prioritised. Beyond that, we're in regular contact with unions, parent representative bodies about measures to reduce risks in schools. The COVID Education Recovery Group that the DFM chairs meets weekly. The guidance for schools is developed with input from all of these and other stakeholders, and it sets out very clear requirements around infection control measures, the use of PPE in appropriate circumstances, and as I said in my statement, we have introduced twice weekly at-home asymptomatic testing available to all school staff and senior phase pupils, which is another layer of assurance. So every step that can be taken to make sure that the school environment is as safe as possible will be taken. And as I said earlier on, I'm very grateful to everybody in the school community for all the work that they're doing to put these plans in place.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Shona Robertson.
There are many reports that vaccinators working same shifts at vaccine centres have vastly different rates of pay. Nurses with years of experience in vaccination in some cases paid up to a third less for the same work. So one nurse wrote to me and said, not only do contractors book shifts before nurses as we don't get direct access to the system, she went on to say, in my last shift I worked with dentists and optometrists. I was much faster, but I was paid a lot less. A GP also wrote to me to say he has the same concerns and that it's harming solidarity among staff due to this unfairness in pay rates. I wonder if the First Minister is able to take any action to ensure that pay rates are reflective of a person's skills. Can she do anything to urge health boards to ensure that there is fairness to nursing staff during the vaccination programme?
First Minister.
This has been raised with me. It's something I've actually asked to be looked at, so I can't give any definitive answer right now, but I recognise the sense of unfairness. In summary, and apologies if I'm not getting all the detail of this right, the rate that a vaccinator will be paid is based on the rate of pay in the job that they do. And obviously, and I'm not making any comment about the fairness or unfairness of this, certain workers in health and social care roles are paid more than others, and that is reflected in the rate of pay that they have for vaccination. Given, though, the particular circumstances of vaccination, there is certainly a question mark in my mind as to whether that is fair, which is why, given that it's been raised with me, I've asked for that to be looked at, and once it has been looked at and I've got more detail I can offer, I'm happy to come back to Pauline McNeill and the Chamber at large.
Thank you. Shona Robertson, to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you. Can I also welcome the clarification in the First Minister's statement for parents of newborn babies? But can I ask the First Minister what discussions the Scottish Government has had with councils and out-of-school care providers to ensure that these vital services will be able to resume when it is safe to do so?
First Minister.
Well, the rules already allow informal childcare to be provided where there's an essential childcare need, which we understand is one of the reasons that other governments have made changes around this too. But I hope this answers Shona Robertson's point. As I said in my statement, we will make clear that there is an extension to essential purposes, and we will continue to work with providers to make sure, in terms of formal childcare, that this is reflected in practice and that the support that is required is made available.
Liz Smith, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you. The Scottish Government last week made a very welcome announcement that non-contact sports for 12 to 17-year-olds can resume on the 15th of March. Could I ask the First Minister to confirm that schools on that date, 15th of March, will be able to open all the facilities for their sports and games field to allow that to happen?
First Minister.
I think the answer certainly the answer I want to give to that, and I think the correct answer to give to that is yes. I'll double check that there is not any caveats to that or any restrictions to that, but of course we want to be able to facilitate that to the full, because it is one of the important ways in which we can try to redress the well-being imbalance that's been created for too many young people across the country.
Thank you. Claire Adamson, to be followed by Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First Minister, my office has been contacted by third sector support workers providing a variety of services to vulnerable people, but including food preparation and delivery. But these workers in my area of Motherwell and Wishaw are not being identified as vaccine priorities by the Health Board. Can I ask the First Minister to ensure that NHS boards, in reaching their understanding of how these workers should be prioritised, is consistent with both the Joint Committee on Vaccine Immunisation guidance, but also consistently across Scotland?
First Minister.
I'm happy to look into this just to make sure I can come back with the answer that it is consistent across Scotland. It certainly should be broadly consistent. The Health Secretary will look into that a bit more. All of these decisions are being guided by the JCVI prioritisation list. There are some issues. We've just been talking about one with people who work very closely with children with multiple complex health needs, where we have defined a particular category as including them. We have taken a similar decision with people with mild to moderate learning disabilities, where previously it was only people with complex learning disabilities that were included. So we are trying to flex each cohort sensibly and as much as possible, but we have to stick as far as we can to those lists so that we are genuinely vaccinating those with greatest clinical needs as early as possible in the prioritisation list. But perhaps the most important point to make in all of these questions about vaccination is that everyone will have been offered first doses by mid-April for that initial JCVI prioritisation list. And just to repeat, that is everybody above the age of 50 and everybody with an underlying health condition, a significant proportion of the adult population. So that's by mid-April, and then by the end of July, supplies permitting, all adults will have been offered a first dose.
Michelle Ballantyne to be followed by Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A constituent of mine, a merchant seafarer who left Scotland to join his cargo ship before the quarantine rules were introduced, now finds himself unable to continue his job unless he accepts not returning to his home and family and pays most of his salary in quarantine costs between ships. Today, he arrived at Edinburgh Airport to be told that he cannot be quarantined in Edinburgh, but will be bussed to Paisley. This has not only added to his deteriorating mental health due to the stress of a lack of shore leave since the outbreak of the pandemic and the stress of the impact of the quarantine rules, he has been running an 80-metre loop of his ship's deck to help manage his well-being, and the prospect of 10 days locked up without exercise or fresh air is now devastating. So can I ask the First Minister, is she aware that there appears to be no rooms for managed quarantine in Edinburgh? And will she give permission for my constituent, who has now been forced out of his job by the decision not to allow him to quarantine at home, to at least run in the fresh air during his 10-day forced quarantine to prevent his mental health and well-being deteriorating further?
First Minister.
I'm not going to comment on the individual case because I don't have all of the details of it. If Michelle Ballantyne wants to send them to my office this afternoon, I will make sure they are looked into. I will also look into the issue of whether there is an inadequacy of rooms at Edinburgh requiring people to go to Paisley, or obviously to help. I imagine that means to hotels in the vicinity of Glasgow Airport. I'm not aware of that, but I'm happy to look into that. Can I ask Michelle Ballantyne, though, and I say this sincerely, is for those of us in positions of responsibility like this, not to describe managed quarantine as being locked up with no fresh air and exercise. This is a vital public health intervention right now. People are entitled to fresh air and exercise. But the reason we are insisting on quarantine, I think, was really well demonstrated at the weekend when we identified these first cases in Scotland of the Brazilian variant. And we worry that these variants, as they come in, will undermine the vaccine and all the good work everybody has been doing. So this is there for a reason. Nobody wants to be asking people to quarantine for 1 day, 2 days, 10 days or whatever, but it is an essential part of the protective measures we need to put in place. I think we've all got a responsibility to help explain that to constituents and also help to encourage people to see the need for it. Nobody is expecting anybody to be happy about any of this right now, but I think we do need to explain and help people to understand the reasons for it. But on the individual case, the circumstances her constituent are in clearly sound very distressing, and I have huge sympathy for that. And for that reason, I'm happy to look into the case. But it's not for me individually as First Minister to give people permission not to comply with these things. It's really important that we do these things properly and decisions are based on the right considerations.
Thank you. And Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Businesses that pay business rates can claim £2,000 a month from the Strategic Business Fund, and this follows from grants already paid. All of this has been necessary for their survival. Businesses that don't pay business rates have similar overheads and have received nothing. They hope to access one-off discretionary grants from local government of £2,000 to compensate them for a year of disruption and closure. Many of these businesses have already permanently closed their doors due to lack of support. I've raised this issue with the First Minister and other Cabinet Secretaries for many months now, and I make no apology for raising it again. So again, can I ask the First Minister, when will she offer these businesses a safety net?
First Minister.
The reason we first thing I should say, it's an important point, and I understand how difficult this is for all businesses, but particularly businesses in the category that have been described. But that is why we established the discretionary funding route for local authorities. We have since significantly increased the money that goes to local authorities for that, to give them the ability to flexibly provide for businesses that fall through the cracks of the other support schemes. In addition to that, we will continue to look at how we fill those cracks and within the resources we have to make sure that we are helping as many individuals and businesses as we can. The most important thing, though, is to get businesses back trading as quickly as possible, which is why it's so important to continue to suppress the virus, get people vaccinated so that as quickly as possible we get the economy opened and businesses making money through their normal trading rather than relying on the support that government is providing.
Thank you very much, colleagues. And that is the end of that statement. Apologies to members who weren't able to call. We're just going to have a short pause and we're going to clean some of the seats and desks to allow ministers and others to change round. So there'll be a short pause before we proceed.
The next item of business is a statement by Graeme on Scottish Parliamentary elections 2021. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Graeme Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last December, Parliament unanimously approved legislation seeking to ensure the safe holding of the Scottish Parliament election on the 6th of May. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to provide an update to members on developments since then. I appreciate that some have expressed genuine concern about the safe holding of the election. I do not wish to minimise or underestimate those concerns, but I do want to provide reassurance that all views are being heard and positive action has been and continues to be taken to ensure the safe delivery of the election. It is as a result of the hard work of electoral professionals over the course of the winter that I am confident that the election can go ahead on the 6th of May. This is also the view of Malcolm Burr, convener of the Electoral Management Board. One of the steps taken, the Scottish General Election Coronavirus Act, was the result of close working between all parties in this chamber and our electoral community. Amongst its provisions, the Act ensures the ability to postpone the election if required, but I'm pleased to say that this does not seem necessary at present. It is fundamental for a democracy to hold scheduled elections, provided it is safe to do so. This Parliament has sat for 5 years, a year longer than originally intended, and many countries have already held elections successfully during the pandemic. It's also the case that 8 local government by-elections were held in Scotland over October and November. Ahead of these elections, the Electoral Management Board issued guidance developed with the assistance of Public Health Scotland. Those elections went well, and the Electoral Commission has used the lessons learned in publishing its guidance for the vote in May. A critical part of our preparations is making sure voters know how they can safely cast their votes. Returning officers are taking steps to ensure that polling places are safe environments with physical distancing, face masks, one-way systems and enhanced cleaning arrangements. Electoral registration officers are also working hard so that those who do not wish to vote in person are able to seek and obtain an absent vote. Our legislation last December moved the deadline for applying for a postal vote to the 6th of April to enable the expected increase in applications to be processed in time. The Government thereafter provided the resources needed for the electoral authorities to write out to every household in Scotland to explain who was registered at the address, who held postal votes there, and how anyone not covered could register or access postal voting. Electoral Commission research suggests that we might see an increase in postal voting from 17% of the electorate up to around 40%, and we've made resources available to allow electoral registration officers to deal with this level of increase and a little beyond that. It's not yet clear what the actual increase will be, but electoral registration officers are already reporting a significant rise in applications following a recent television advertising campaign and the notification letter from EROs. Additionally, the Chief Medical Officer has written to all shielding households to encourage those people and their families to consider obtaining a postal vote. As of the 19th of January, EROs across Scotland had received around 70,000 requests for postal vote application forms from electors. Completed application forms are now being returned, and the initial data from EROs confirms a significant increase in postal vote applications in February. The full figures are not yet available, but indications are that at least 60,000 people were granted a postal vote over the course of February. It's also clear that at least 10 local authority areas now have at least 20% of their electorate issued with a postal vote. We've made it possible for anyone who is unable to vote in person due to testing positive or having to self-isolate to apply for a proxy vote, an option which is available until 5 p.m. on the day of poll. In addition, there is legislation before the Parliament at the moment which will now allow someone who has already appointed a proxy to change their appointed proxy if the original is no longer available to vote on their behalf. These changes to both postal and proxy voting are intended to help anyone who wishes to vote in May's election to do so, no matter their personal circumstances. So to summarise, anyone can apply for a postal vote before the 6th April deadline, and those who find themselves unable to vote in person due to coronavirus advice can apply for a proxy to be appointed up until 5 p.m. on polling day. And of course, I would emphasise that returning officers are carrying out risk assessments and that polling stations will be set up on the basis of advice provided by the Electoral Commission in conjunction with Public Health Scotland, so it will be safe to vote in person. In addition to the Electoral Commission's detailed guidance on running a COVID-secure election, the convener of the EMB has been exercising his power to issue directions to returning officers, a power that this Parliament bestowed upon him last June in the Scottish Elections Reform Act. He has directed that no more than 800 electors are to be allocated to a single polling station and that counts should occur in the daytime. The convener has also set out a risk assessment approach for returning officers to follow, and he has confirmed that the power under the recent Act to allow polling over multiple days is not required. In relation to the count, it seems inevitable that the results of the election will take longer to arrive. Ensuring physical distance while also allowing the process to be scrutinised means that not all constituencies will be counted simultaneously. It's expected that most counting will occur over the Friday and the Saturday following polling day. Returning officers will be talking to candidates locally about arrangements, and those discussions are important to achieve a shared understanding of what will happen in practice. I'll now turn to the important topic of campaigning, Presiding Officer. I know that parties have not been leafleting or campaigning door to door during lockdown, and alternatives to face-to-face campaigning can be employed. But clearly, we would all like to know when it will be possible to undertake usual, or as close to usual as possible, campaign activity. The Electoral Commission is preparing guidance for candidates and campaigners, and its guidance will align with what is permitted under the necessary public health restrictions. I can confirm that under the stay-at-home regulations, it is permitted for candidates and agents to travel to the constituency as necessary, as this is work or volunteering which cannot be done from home. It's also been suggested that the leadership of each party should also be able to travel to any given constituency. That is something we are looking at, though we should bear in mind that the regulations currently prevent all of us from leaving home and travelling between local authorities for work that can be done from home. The update to the strategic framework that was published last week set out a plan for gradual easing of current measures when the epidemiological conditions allow that to be done safely. The update included a likely phasing of easing of restrictions at intervals of at least 3 weeks to allow assessment of data and of progress in suppression of the virus. In line with that, I will advise Parliament that leafleting can commence from the 15th of March, subject to the restrictions on social gatherings in level 4 areas easing to allow up to 4 people from 2 different households to meet outdoors. Guidance will be issued to keep everyone safe. And I'm sure that candidates and campaigners will accept the need to strictly observe the need for mitigation measures such as physical distancing, the wearing of face masks where appropriate, ensuring hand hygiene and not car sharing. Guidance will also be issued on safe arrangements for liaising with volunteers and minimising the handling of materials. Face-to-face campaigning on the doorstep cannot commence at the same time as leafleting. Careful consideration has been given to the role of canvassing during an ongoing pandemic, the risks associated with it, where allowing doorstep campaigning would sit with other non-election restrictions, and how the public might react to having political campaigners at their door. I recognise, however, that there is an appetite for it to be permitted in due course. And in light of discussion with clinical advisers and providing the stay-at-home restrictions are able to be lifted, face-to-face doorstep campaigning can be permitted from April 5, subject to the virus being sufficiently suppressed. Now, that decision will be based on whether the infection rate as an average across Scotland has fallen to 50 per 100,000 or less. The number which the WHO considers as evidence that the pandemic is sufficiently under control, and alongside this, test positive numbers must sit below 5%. I should add that if the infection rate in a specific council area were to exceed 100 per 100,000, then canvassing would have to be suspended for safety reasons in that specific local authority until the rate fell below that number. For information for the Chamber, the cumulative 7-day incidence per 100,000 of the population by specimen date to the 27th of February is 79.6, and the latest 7-day average test positivity rate is 3.9%. Once the restrictions permit, it will be a judgment call for parties as to whether they should pursue such activity, whether it will be welcomed by the public, and in what type of specific locality. They also need to be conscious of striking the right balance between ensuring only one person approaches a doorstep, but providing reassurance for canvassers in having a colleague close by for safety. The numbers of people who can be together at any one point must be in line with the broader restrictions on social interaction that are in place at the time. But this approach, I hope, balances political engagement with protecting public health. I'm afraid, however, that activities such as street stalls and physical hustings and giving voters a lift to polling stations cannot proceed, given the circumstances we find ourselves in. These limitations have been discussed in recent weeks with the business managers of all parties, and I believe all parties are supportive of them. I hope that this statement, Presiding Officer, has provided reassurance to members on the enormous amount of work underway across our electoral community to ensure that the election in May can be conducted safely in an adjusted form. And I want to conclude my remarks by offering sincere thanks to all those involved in preparations for the polling and the counting of votes, and also those representatives of the parties which sit in this Parliament and who have engaged entirely constructively both around the shaping of this guidance and more general planning throughout the process we've gone through over the recent months. The approach to those discussions has demonstrated a collective willingness to be responsible in our approach to campaigning, and I look forward to seeing that maintained in the heat of the campaign. Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Minister. The Minister will now take questions on issues raised. Now, I tend to allow 20 minutes around about that. I try to get everybody in. I know you're all interested in this. I call Miles Briggs, to be followed by Sarah Boyd. Mr Briggs.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement and welcome the clarity which he's outlined today. This year's Scottish Parliament election will be an event unlike any other, but I'm sure we'll all welcome the opportunity to soon get back out speaking to voters as soon as it's safe to do so. And whilst it's important that campaigns are able able to operate as much as possible, we need to make sure we do not compromise any of the public health achievements which we've achieved in recent weeks and months. Can I ask the Minister a couple of questions specifically? When will the guidance he's mentioned be published so that political parties have the time to safely put in place advice to all campaigners? And if we are going to see a fair election, it's vital that strict purdah rules also cover ministers. Does the Minister agree with this? And in that case, will the Minister confirm that government statements and briefings will be led by public officials when this Parliament rises on the 24th of March?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, guidance will be issued as soon as possible. Purdah rules will be followed as they always are. The First Minister touched upon the point that Miles Briggs raised, I think, at FMQs last week, and further detail on that will be forthcoming. But I would point out to Miles Briggs that the most important thing about these briefings is the assurance that the First Minister provides the public, because we are still in the midst of a pandemic.
Sarah Boyd, followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and the Minister for advance notice of his statement. I agree our top priority must be public health and safety for everyone involved in the election, staff and voters. Can the Minister say what modelling has been done on the impact of the election campaign on the prevalence of COVID and the likelihood of people to vote? And will he be giving us more clarity on postal votes? Because I know you've referenced 10 local authorities across the country. Councillors have raised with me concerns about safety at polling stations, for example, what happens if someone can't or won't wear a mask. And can you clarify the guidance will address issues such as canvassing tenements and flats from the 5th of April? Don't we need clarity on these issues rather than letting up to the different political parties to make that kind of judgment?
Can I just remind members not to use the term you? I'm flailing against the wind here after 5 years, but I keep trying. Minister.
Presiding Officer, I thought you were going to remind the member about multiple questions within a single question, and I've lost track, and I apologise, and I will come back to Sarah Bork if there's any. Postal votes, the postal vote numbers we will update on a weekly basis from the 15th of March. In terms of people not wearing masks at polling stations, I take it she means entering polling stations, there will be additional members of staff on duty at polling places to encourage members to do that. But she makes a valid point, and the police will have a role to play in the election in this regard as well. In terms of what buildings can and can't be canvassed, that really is, I think, for the parties to determine. I don't think it's for us to be prescriptive about you cannot canvass such and such a building or whatever. I think this is one, and I am confident that the parties will exercise common sense in their approach to this. And I apologise if there's any other questions I haven't picked up. I will come back to Sarah Boyd.
And I remind the Minister, as the front bencher, Ms Boyd is entitled to ask within her time certain number of questions if she wishes. Just to correct the record for you, Minister. Patrick Harvey, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As well as objective safety being important, the perception of safety is also important. That will apply to political parties, for example, making judgments on that last point about canvassing in enclosed spaces such as tenement closes, but it's also relevant to voters turning up to vote in person. What action is going to be taken to build public confidence so that people have a high degree of confidence in the safety of the voting process? This is the perception is important just as much as the reality.
Minister.
I think Patrick Harvey makes some good points there about the perception of safety. So let's deal with this first in the context of political parties. Self-evidently, it would be a very bad idea for parties to descend on an area en masse, having car shared. I mean, this kind of thing is completely unacceptable in the current climate. And as I say, I'm confident that the parties will adhere to that. In terms of public confidence, I think Patrick makes a good point. Clearly, the larger number of postal votes that we can see issued or taken up will ensure that there will be fewer individuals going to the polling station. So if it's seen not to be particularly busy, that will give confidence. But clearly there is a job to be done between now and then in terms of boosting public confidence to go out and vote on the day. I think the fact that we have 11 council by-elections taking place in the next few weeks will give clear evidence of the safety that surrounds being able to vote. And I think it's also incumbent on us as political parties and as politicians to encourage the public that it is possible to go and cast their vote in person if that's what they require to do.
Willie Rennie, followed by Bill Kidd.
I'm grateful for the Minister's approach to this issue throughout. We've worked together constructively. We are content with what he's set out today. It's important to have safe voting and a safe campaign in order to have a valid election campaign. But can I press him further on the COVID briefings? If the First Minister felt compelled last week to answer a question about Salmond in the COVID briefing, how will she avoid answering a question about the campaign in the election if she continues to front those COVID briefings? Minister.
I think Willie Rennie knows full well that the First Minister would be able to negotiate quite comfortably such a situation. I'm a little bit surprised about this obsession about the public briefings. These are public health briefings that have proved essential throughout the past year. And for Willie Rennie, who I have great respect for, to imply that somehow the First Minister would take advantage of that is beneath him, frankly.
Now, I've got lots of members want to have short questions with short answers. Don't think I'm going to get to everybody, but I'll try. Bill Kidd, followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank the Minister. Local authorities will need to make a range of changes to polling places to ensure they are COVID safe. Can the Minister provide any further information as to what steps the Scottish Government is taking to support local authorities with the costs of introducing safety measures?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, that has been done. A sum, I think, totalling £10 million has been set aside for the delivery of the election. All reasonable asks have been met, and there is a contingency there for any further reasonable asks to be met in terms of delivering the election as we go forward.
Thank you. Oliver Mundell, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These are difficult decisions which require a very careful balance between public health and enabling the democratic process to take place. I know the Minister appreciates that, but does he accept that the idea of giving any form of campaigning the green light will cause concern to some who understandably remain anxious? And can he therefore reassure Parliament that any further relaxation of campaign rules will be mindful of public confidence in ongoing restrictions and seek to avoid any perception that different rules apply to politicians?
Minister.
I agree entirely with Oliver Mundell's point. I think it is important that the public see what we are agreeing to today in the right light. And there will be people who will be concerned about this. It then becomes incumbent, as I've said a number of times, on the parties to behave in a way which does not disquiet the public. And I have every confidence that can be done. But I think he does make a valid point, and it's a reminder to all of us about the concerns that the public have currently, and we should be mindful of that as we enter the campaign.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Minister mentioned in his statement that it will be possible for anyone who is unable to vote in person due to testing positive or having to self-isolate to apply for a proxy vote, and that up until 5 p.m. on the day of poll. I think this is an important measure, but can the Minister advise as to what the Scottish Government will do to ensure that people are aware that this facility is there, and also to explain how, in terms of the mechanics, they would actually make such an application? Thank you.
Minister.
Presiding Officer, information to that end will be provided on every polling card. The Electoral Commission are making voters aware through their public awareness campaign, and their booklet on the Scottish Parliament elections that will be delivered to every household week commencing the 22nd of March. Returning officers and electoral registration officers will publicise availability of emergency proxies through social media and other press nearer the time. I think all round we will be able to address the matter the member rightly raises.
Colin Smith, followed by Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The decision to hold the election in May rather than wait a few weeks until the end of July when everyone is vaccinated means that cross-local authority travel restrictions will still be in place. So how does the Minister justify telling the public that for health reasons they can't visit their loved ones, even in the garden, if they happen to live in another council area. But election candidates will be able to travel, in some cases for regional candidates, from one side of the country to the other to knock on the doors of anyone asking for the vote. That is, Minister, one rule for politicians and one for the public. And simply saying to parties foregoing democratic engagement on the doorstep isn't the solution.
Minister.
Yeah, well, I'm a little bit disappointed to hear Colin Smith's question, given that his party has engaged constructively in getting us to this point as well. But I would make the point to him, it's one thing facilitating an election agent and a candidate to travel to a constituency where they may be standing or working in and they don't happen to live in. We're not talking about mass transference of activists across Scotland. We're talking about individuals travelling to take part in a major democratic event.
Willie Coffey, followed by John Scott.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Many countries around the world have held elections during the pandemic. Can the Minister confirm that the Scottish Government has been looking at what lessons can be learned from those elections and put those lessons in place?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, there's been 83 national elections or referenda held across the globe during the pandemic, and a number of the measures that we will be deploying have been deployed in those. But I would say to Willie Coffey, perhaps more relevant have been the lessons we've learned from our own domestic by-elections that have taken place. There's quite a lot been derived from that. And as I say, a number of measures, for example, the additional member of staff at the polling station to direct voters, limiting the number of voters in each box, are examples of things that we've learned from these by-elections.
John Scott, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the arrangements made for polling day when only 800 people will be allowed at each polling station. Some polling stations would usually expect more people at them and some less. Will there be an effort made by local authorities to direct voters to different polling stations and draw voters' attention to different polling stations where voters will be required to vote at a polling station which is not the one they would usually vote at?
Minister.
I think we need to draw a distinction between polling places and polling stations. So what we're looking at is extending the number of essentially rooms within a school, for example, or a building where people will be directed to. So yes, John Scott's right, there will be some changes to venues will take place across the country. But essentially this is about limiting the number of people who would enter a particular part of a building to cast their vote. That's what we're predominantly looking at.
Maureen Watt, followed by James Kelly.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Minister provide any further information on what steps the Government is taking to raise awareness of postal voting, particularly amongst the elderly, vulnerable and less mobile, since it will not be possible for anyone other than possibly family to give them a lift to the polling station?
Minister.
Presiding Officer, there's been extensive work done already on raising awareness of the option of postal voting. As I say, the proxy voting aspect of this has been developed as well. And of course, the CMO has written out to everyone on the shielding list. So I think we've covered the bases as far as it's possible to do. But, again, the opportunity is there for the parties to take their share of responsibility and increase awareness of this. I think we've done a reasonable job thus far, but I'm happy to hear from members of all parties if they have further ideas they think we should take on board.
James Kelly, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. For the election to proceed, public will need to be confident in the safety of the polling places and also the protection afforded across constituencies. Can I therefore ask the Minister, in terms of the by-elections that are taking place, will there be an open and transparent assessment of any issues that arise, and will the Minister update Parliament on any problems that crop up?
Minister.
I think it's a fair point to make. I mean, we have these by-elections coming forward. There is always an ongoing assessment of that. What I'm quite happy to do is to arrange a further briefing with the Electoral Management Board to the one that we had a few weeks ago to provide members with answers to questions such as that and to find out if any further issues have been identified through the by-election process and what measures we would take by way of response.
And Ruth Maguire.
Presiding Officer, safety is of paramount importance. Can the Minister expand on what measures are being taken to ensure the protection of the local authority workforce involved in the operation of the elections, both on polling day and at the count, please?
Minister.
Again, the member makes a very good point. The safety of election workers is paramount, and there's been extensive planning done around social distancing and other measures. But there is something else that we have been looking at, which I'll share with members, and that is the possibility of providing further reassurance by having asymptomatic testing to everyone who might be present at the count. Now, that's been welcomed in principle by the EMB, but there are a number of issues to be considered, not least of all the one which concerns the returning officers wanting that to take place the evening before the count in order, rightly, that they could replace any workers who tested positive. Countering that, however, is the fact it's believed that lateral flow testing is of less case-finding value if conducted the evening before someone goes to their workplace than if it's done a short time before they attend. The other point here is that this has to be nationwide. So the EMB are therefore taking soundings from all 32 returning officers at the moment, and we will consider this matter further when we have the responses concerned.
Thank you. That concludes questions on the statement. I thank members and the Minister as we managed to get all the questions in. There will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business.
Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 24259 in the name of Graeme Day on behalf of the Bureau, setting out a timetable for the Stage 3 consideration of the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill. Could I call on Graeme Day to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Minister. No member has indicated they wish to speak in the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 24259 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. So the next item is consideration of the bill. In dealing with amendments, members should have with them the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill at Stage 2, the marshal list, the grouping of amendments. The division bell will sound. Proceedings will be suspended for 5 minutes for the first division, if there is a division this afternoon, and the period of voting for each division will be 1 minute. Members who wish to speak in the debate on any group of amendments should press their request to speak button as I call that group. And members should now turn to the marshalled list. So Group 1, Serious Threshold Test. Can I call Amendment 5 in the name of Andy Whiteman, grouped with Amendments 6 and 7. Andy Whiteman to move Amendment 5 and speak to all the amendments in this group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At Stage 1 and Stage 2, I've expressed the view that the serious harm threshold is not justified. I take that view, contrary to the view I once held, that it was justified. And I take that view as a legislator, considering the evidence that's been presented and in the interests of ensuring that the people of Scotland have a remedy available to them if they feel that their reputation has been harmed. In the committee's Stage 1 report, members recommended, and I quote, that the Scottish Government reviews the evidence we have heard and sets out a clear statement on why the serious harm test is still required. I'm not persuaded that the Minister has done that in her response to the Stage 1 report, nor in response to my amendments at Stage 2. My amendments have the effect of removing the serious harm test in Section 1, and while still maintaining a threshold test for actionability, modify it to actual harm rather than serious harm. And I do this for two reasons. First, as I indicated, I do not believe that a threshold of serious harm is justified by the evidence. The serious harm test was introduced to the Defamation Act 2013 in England for reasons that are well known, namely the volume of litigation and the vexatious nature of some of it, and because there was also a muddle in English law as a consequence of the distinct wrongs of slander and libel, a muddle that, as Professor Blackie pointed out in Stage 1 evidence, we do not have in Scotland. The Scottish Law Commission concluded that a threshold was desirable, but it spent very little time considering at what height the bar should be set. My second reason is that the bill introduces at section 14A a statutory definition of defamation that, and I quote, "A statement about a person is defamatory if it causes harm to the person's reputation, that is, if it tends to lower the person's reputation in the estimation of ordinary persons." So it's defamatory if it causes harm. We've never had this before, relying up until now on the famous Sim versus Stretch test in common law. The Scottish Law Commission never recommended such a statutory definition in its reports or its final draft bill. And therefore we are in the curious and I would say bizarre position of proposing to enshrine in law a statutory civil wrong while saying in the very same section of the bill that there's nothing that anyone can do about it unless they can demonstrate that the harm is serious. Now, if Parliament agrees that this is a problem, then there's two ways of dealing with it. We could amend section 14A to insert the word serious in front of harm, so as to bring the civil wrong and the actionability thresholds into alignment. Or we could pass my amendments 5, 6 and 7, which retain the statutory definition, but amend the threshold test to one of actual as opposed to serious harm. And thus we would allow everyone who feels that their reputation has indeed been harmed, according to section 1 and according to the bill we'll pass this evening, to have access to justice, but to have to demonstrate to the court that the harm is or is likely to be actual harm and not merely presumed, as is the situation today. I move Amendment 5.
Thank you very much, Mr Whitman. And I call John Finney.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And I wish to speak in support of my colleague Andy Whiteman's comments. And I think when at the outset Mr Whiteman said they should review these positions, I think that's a strength, it's not a weakness, and certainly it's caused me to review the approach. Mr Whiteman's talked about the scrutiny that went on at stage 1, and I think in the stage 2 debate he used the term appropriate qualifier. A threshold is needed. I support that it's actual harm rather than serious harm, and the Lachaud case, which has been referred to, certainly in one of the briefings I have, it says that, and I quote, Scottish courts will treat Lachaud as persuasive authority and follow a similar approach. I certainly find Mr Whiteman's arguments persuasive, and not just in respect of this, but also in respect of creating an offence and then immediately limiting access to it, because there aren't many other remedies. So for all these reasons, I support these amendments in Mr Whiteman's name, and I encourage colleagues to do likewise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Finney. And can I call Adam Tompkins?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've got the greatest of respect for Andy Whiteman's knowledge and experience of the law of defamation, but I'm afraid I don't agree with his arguments that he's put today, which are identical to the arguments that he put at stage 2 when these amendments were either not pressed or defeated if they were pressed. I can't now remember which. And the reason why I don't support his argument is because I don't agree with his argument, is because this bill does something really, really important. It doesn't just modernise the law of defamation and make it fit for purpose. It shifts the balance between the way in which we protect freedom of speech and the way in which we protect the right to protect one's reputation, the right to privacy. And it shifts that balance subtly, but importantly in favour of free speech. And one of the key ways in which it does that is by inserting the serious harm test in section 1. And I would be very reluctant indeed to see that shift go backwards. Anybody who knows anything about defamation law in this country, and as I've already said, Andy Whiteman knows plenty about it, knows that it does not protect freedom of expression sufficiently robustly. And these changes are really important, as was recognised in the evidence at stage 1 that the Justice Committee took on this point. For example, from Scottish Pen evidence that was given by Andrew Tickell, who said that the serious harm test was appropriate in terms of free expression. To give another example, the evidence that the committee took from the NUJ, if harm has been done to someone's reputation, it's in everyone's interest that that is addressed quickly, and having a serious harm threshold will allow clarity at an early stage to ensure that that is done. This has got nothing to do with respect to keeping pace with the law of England and Wales, where this change was made a few years ago. It's got everything to do with ensuring that our Scots law of defamation holds the balance between free expression and protection of the right to reputation correctly. And the serious harm test is a really important part of the way in which this bill, in my judgment, achieves that balance. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Tompkins. And I call on the Minister Ashton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These amendments are the same as Amendments 30, 31 and 36 that Andy Whiteman lodged at stage 2 and that were rejected by the committee at that stage. The threshold test of serious harm is an important reform of the current Scots law of defamation, and it is central to rebalancing the law of defamation. Indeed, Scottish Pen described the threshold test as critical to the heart of the bill. And overall, the Scottish Government's view is that where damage to reputation is presumed, as currently happens, the law does not get that balance right. And so the threshold test recommended by the Scottish Law Commission for a number of reasons, and I'm certain that the Commission considered the need for the test and the level at which it was set very carefully. Amendments 5 and 6 would replace the serious harm test with one of actual harm, and this would set the bar too low. It would mean that any evidence of harm, no matter how little, would be enough to meet the test. And these amendments would signal to our courts that this Parliament intends something different from the serious harm test. We would not have clarity on how courts should treat the threshold test of serious harm that has come with the UK Supreme Court's interpretation of Section 1 of the Defamation Act of 2013 in England and Wales. And the result is likely to be a long period of doubt and uncertainty about what the test of actual harm means. And I would point out that this is the exact opposite of what the bill is trying to achieve. It is certain, however, that Andy Whiteman means the level of actual harm to be lower than serious harm. So why should the people of Scotland have less protection for their freedom of expression than people in England and Wales? I will.
Andy Whiteman.
I thank the Minister for giving way. She makes a good point, but I suppose my rejoinder would be that why are we legislating to create a statutory definition about causing harm and then not allowing anyone to take any action if harm has been caused that doesn't meet the serious harm threshold?
Minister.
Because the two things are different. We have the definition, and the serious harm threshold is for actionability. So if someone can prove that they have been harmed, they will be able to take that forward in the court. And I think it is important that if you have been harmed, you should be able to show the court how you have been harmed. So I think for the overall balance of the bill, that this serious harm threshold test is extremely important. So Amendment 6 would have the effect of creating two different thresholds, one for individuals and another for companies and partnerships that trade for profit. And individuals would need to show actual harm and companies would need to show serious financial loss. But not every company is a multinational with an annual turnover in the millions of pounds. And if a company was an individual or a charity, it could easily show actual harm, but instead it must show serious financial loss. So why would the law treat these companies differently? Most companies in Scotland are small or micro enterprises, and for them, reputation will be vitally important. Andy Whiteman also raises a concern about the law defining a harm, but then saying if you haven't been seriously harmed, you cannot pursue a civil remedy. And to that, I would point out to him that the use of thresholds is common in both criminal and civil law to indicate that a particular level of conduct or damage is required before a particular legal remedy or consequence is appropriate. And I'll just give a couple of examples of that. So in Part 2 of the Adoption and Children Scotland Act of 2007, and this concerns making permanent orders whereby paternal rights and responsibilities are vested in a local authority, there is to be a seriously detrimental to the welfare of the child. And then in another example, this Parliament recently considered and agreed to Section 38 of the UK withdrawal from the European Union Continuity Scotland Act of 2021. And this section sets out a serious failure test that must be met in order to raise successful judicial review proceedings in relevant circumstances. And again, setting the threshold is not just an actual failure, but a serious failure. And so that is just a couple of examples, but there are more, Presiding Officer, and it's common for the law to recognise that there may be a wrong, but it does not reach a high enough level to warrant successful court proceedings. And setting the threshold test too low could have serious consequences for freedom of expression. It would not give enough confidence to those who wish to defend their freedom of expression in the face of a defamation action, while making it only slightly more difficult to protect reputation. The crucial importance of freedom of expression justifies this sensible threshold. Andy Whiteman's amendments would nudge the threshold upwards, I believe, only slightly from what we currently have. And in my opinion, that is not high enough. So I would ask the member not to press the amendments 5, 6 and 7. But if he does press them, then I would ask the Chamber to vote with me in opposing them.
Thank you, Minister. And can I call on Andy Whiteman to conclude and wind up in this section?
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I thank those who have contributed to this. I respect Mr Tompkins' arguments about shifting the balance, and I agree with that. Indeed, I agree with the Minister on that point. But in my view, shifting it to actual harm and doing away with the presumption does indeed shift that. With respect, Mr Tompkins did not address my critique of creating a new statutory wrong and in the same section creating a threshold for actionability. And the Minister talked about, for example, adoption legislation. I think it's one thing to, on an ongoing basis, to set various criteria and thresholds for actionability. It's quite another to create a new statutory wrong in a piece of legislation and in the very same section saying that there's nothing you can do about it. My concern in this legislation has been that those who suffer harm, a statutory wrong that we'll be passing tonight, probably, do not have a remedy available to them, and that causes me a problem. But nevertheless, I understand the arguments being put at stage 1, 2 and 3, and don't anticipate this will be getting much further, but at least Presiding Officer have managed to put the arguments on the record and Parliament will be able to test them. Thanks.
Can I assume from that, Mr Whiteman, that you're pressing to a vote?
Yes, I'm pressing Amendment 5.
Thank you very much, colleagues. So the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We will move to a division. Members will need to access the voting app, so I'm going to suspend Parliament for 5 minutes to call some members to the chamber and the others to access the voting app. 5 minutes suspension. Last reminder, colleagues, the pin for today is 7566, and we will be switching broadcasting back on shortly. 7566. Thank you, colleagues. We are now back in session. So we're going to move straight to the vote. The question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to the vote. Members, may press their buttons now. This will be a 1-minute division on Amendment 5. That vote is now closed. Please let me know if you were not able to vote. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 5 in the name of Andy Whiteman is yes 32, no 86. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Can I call amendment 6 in the name of Andy Whiteman? Andy Whiteman to move or not move? That is not moved. I'm turning now to Group 2. This is on secondary publication regulation making power. Can I call Amendment 1 in the name of Liam Kerr in a group on its own? Liam Kerr to move and speak to Amendment 1.
Yeah, thank you, Presiding Officer. Colleagues will recall that this was an amendment that I brought forward at Stage 2, which sought to limit the delegated powers of ministers to technical amendments whilst allowing flexibility to modernise the law in line with technological developments. Now, to explain what I mean by that, Section 3.6 enables the Scottish Ministers to make regulations modifying subsections 3 or 4 to add, alter or remove activities or methods of disseminating or processing material which can be undertaken by a person without being classified as an author, editor or publisher, or, in the case of an employee or agent of such a person, being responsible for its content and the decision to publish it. Now, the underlying purpose here is to restrict the regulation-making power in subsection 6 so it can only be used in consequence of technological developments. Now, at Stage 2 in debate, it was felt that such power would be too restrictive, so I didn't press it, pending discussion with the Minister and her officials to ensure any amendment captured the policy intention more accurately. I'm very grateful to the Minister and her officials for their assistance in this regard. My redrafted amendment therefore permits regulations to be made only where Scottish ministers consider it appropriate to take account of two different situations. The first reflects technological developments, including where certain technologies cease to be used, relating to the dissemination or processing of materials. The second reflects changes in how material is disseminated or processed as a result of such developments. Any such regulations are to be subject to the affirmative procedure, and stakeholders therefore will have an opportunity to express their views on any proposed change, and ultimately Parliament will decide whether a proposed change is appropriate. Presiding Officer, I believe this is a good amendment and I seek Parliament's support for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Kerr. I don't have any other indication that members wish to contribute. Minister.
Sir, someone who is not the author, editor or primary publisher of a defamatory statement should not be liable for it, except to the extent that they are responsible for a statement's content or the decision to publish it. So Section 3 gives effect to this purpose and limits the circumstances in which a defamation action can be brought against a secondary publisher. And Scottish ministers are given regulation-making powers to adjust the subsections which lay out the activities which a person can carry out without being classed as an author, editor or publisher. And the Scottish Government made clear in its Delegated Powers Memorandum that the reason for taking this power is to ensure that the provision is future-proofed to deal with any technological changes. Any regulation-making power should not be too expansive, particularly as any regulations made by Scottish ministers in connection with this section will have a significant impact on freedom of expression. So this amendment will make sure that the power of Scottish ministers is not too wide, that it will unduly restrict freedom of expression without Parliament's consent, but also wide enough to allow Scottish ministers to account for any necessary changes. And it's worth remembering that any proposed regulations are to be put out to consultation and they are subject to the affirmative procedure. So stakeholders will have an opportunity to express their views on any proposed change, and ultimately it will be for the Scottish Parliament to decide whether a proposed change is appropriate. And it's my view that this amendment achieves the proper balance between making sure that those who need the protections of this section are given it in good time, and the need to make sure that powers of Scottish ministers to restrict freedom of expression are not unnecessarily wide. So I'm grateful to Liam Kerr for agreeing to work with the Scottish Government to prepare this amendment, and I would encourage members to join with me in supporting it.
Thank you. Does Mr Kerr wish to add any further comment?
I don't, but I will press the amendment.
Thank you very much. So the question is, the Amendment 1 be agreed to? Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 7, Andy Whiteman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved, thank you. Can I turn now to Group 3? This is on the powers of the Court. Can I call Amendment 8 in the name of Fulton McGregor, grouped with Amendment 9. Fulton McGregor to move Amendment 8 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendments 8 and 9 in my name. These are amendments that follow on from a previous amendment that I lodged at Stage 2. I'd like to start by placing on record my thanks to the Minister for her commitment to work with me ahead of today. The aim of these amendments is to achieve a proportionate balance between the protection of reputation, the right to freedom of expression and the power of the court to make orders to the operator of a website in the early stages of defamation proceedings. Section 30 is intended to provide for the fact that it may not always be possible for the author of material which is subject to of defamation proceedings or proceedings under Part 2 for a malicious publication, prevent further distribution of the material or orchestrate its removal. To address that, subsection 1 currently empowers the court to order the removal of material which is subject of defamation or malicious publication proceedings from any website on which it appears, as well as to order a person who was not the author, editor or publisher of the material stop distributing, selling or exhibiting material containing the statement. Section 30 in the bill, as it currently stands, would allow a court to order the operator of a website to remove the statement which is the subject of a complaint. Where a court has had the chance to consider the argument from both sides and come to a full conclusion, the order to remove a statement that has been found to be defamatory is an entirely reasonable one. However, in the explanatory notes for the bill, it is explained that this power is not confined to circumstances in which the final outcome of proceedings has already been determined by a court. Accordingly, the court would be entitled in an appropriate case to grant an order for a removal or cessation of distribution on an interim basis before the final outcome of the proceedings is known. The power of the court to order removal before a full decision has taken place seems unnecessary, given other alternative measures which this amendment seeks to introduce. In evidence sessions of the Justice Committee, concerns were raised by media groups including the Society of Authors, Scottish Pen, the BBC and the Ferret through legal academics, and from civil society organisations like Scottish Pen and the Open Rights Group. And I'd like to thank all of these organisations, and particularly Matthew Rice from the Open Rights Group, for their input in the development of these amendments. So in seeking a proportionate balance in these early stages of the defamation dispute in the court system, this amendment proposes to amend Section 30 by introducing a court power to order the website operator to include in the website a prominent notice that the statement is subject to the proceedings. This notice must be in a place or forum that ensures that a person accessing the statement is made aware of the notice every time that they access the statement. I should make it clear that this amendment seeks to leave intact the power of the court to order operators to order the operator by interdict to remove the statement at the end of the proceedings. It is focused primarily on when the proceedings are ongoing, and this power would be appropriate to be exercised. Additionally, nothing in this amendment prevents the website operator from removing the statement complained of themselves, which they are entitled to do throughout any potential defamation dispute. I believe the addition of a notice power for the court meets the policy objectives of the bill to strike an appropriate balance between freedom of expression and protection of reputation, clarifies the law and improves its accessibility. And I move the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr McGregor. And can I call on John Finney?
Thank you very much indeed, President Officer. Mr McGregor mentions the Open Rights Society, and I commend a lot of their work. And indeed, it was via that route that I was lobbied by a constituent concerned, and I quote here that as things stood, you were guilty and until proven innocent. And I can commend the words that they went on to say about Mr McGregor's amendment, that these safeguards will better balance the right of freedom of expression online with the need to fairly protect reputation. And for these reasons, I hope others will join in supporting Mr McGregor's very worthy amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Finney. And can I call on the Minister, Ashton?
So an important feature of this bill is the range of new powers given to courts that will help repair unfair damage done to an individual's reputation. Ordinarily, a court would have awarded damages, but if this Parliament agrees, a court will be able to allow a statement to be read in court, order a summary of its judgment to be published, and order the removal of material from a website. Section 30 grants courts the power to order the removal of material which is the subject of defamation or Part 2 proceedings from any website on which it appears. And this is an effective remedy that will, in relevant circumstances, help to prevent ongoing unfair damage to an individual's reputation. A similar power has been conferred on courts in England and Wales by the Defamation Act of 2013, and the bill before us today seeks to grant Scottish courts the same. There may, however, be situations where a court decides that removing a statement altogether does not properly balance the rights of protection of reputation and freedom of expression. It could be that the proper balance favours continued publication of the statement complained of, but with a notice affixed to it that lets those accessing it know that it is subject to defamation or malicious publication proceedings. For example, this could be where proceedings are ongoing and a court has not yet made a final determination. The notice permitted by this amendment would be attached on the website to the statement complained of, and it must be prominent. This means it cannot be hidden away on some other web page or set out in tiny print, and therefore easily overlooked by users viewing the allegedly defamatory statement. It must also be visible to each individual user every time they access the statement, for so long as the proceedings are ongoing or such other time period ordered by the court. The amendment lodged by Fulton McGregor will make all this clear, and should a court decide to use this power. It is another remedy that the court can use to assist in restoring a person's unfairly damaged reputation, and is added to others that the Scottish Government have introduced. And having it on the face of the bill means that an individual knows that this is one of a number of remedies they can seek from a court in order to protect and restore their damaged reputation. And I hope members will join me in supporting this amendment.
Thank you, Minister. And can I call, does Mr McGregor wish to add any comments by way of winding up?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd just like to simply end by thanking the Minister and her officials again. The amendment lodged before members today isn't changed substantially from that was at stage 2, but by working with the Minister and officials, perhaps we've been able to find more balance and perhaps alleviate any slight concerns that there were at stage 2. So I thank the Minister again, and yes, press the amendment in Manny.
Thank you very much. So the question is that Amendment 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Can I call Amendment 9, Fulton McGregor, to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are all agreed. We're going to turn now to Group 4. This is on EU exit technical amendments. Can I call Amendment 2 in the name of the Minister, group with Amendment 4, Minister to move Amendment 2 and speak to both amendments?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These are technical amendments arising out of the UK's departure from the European Union. And Amendment 2 in my name removes a reference to Section 19F of the Prescription and Limitation Scotland Act of 1973. And that section was recently repealed by regulations that have now come into effect following the end of the transition period after the UK left the EU. As for Amendment 4, a statement which is false and defamatory is presumed to be made with malice, and that presumption is rebutted if the statement is subject to qualified privilege. In the event of qualified privilege attaching, it is for the pursuer to pursue malice. Qualified privilege arises both at common law and under statute, and Schedule 1 lists a number of communications which are privileged. One such communication, however, refers to another member state, and as the UK is no longer a member of the EU, this amendment will rectify this. The amendment will maintain the current position under the law, and no restriction of freedom of expression should result. So I move Amendment 2 and ask members to support both the amendments that are in this group.
Thank you, Minister. And no member appears to have indicated they wish to speak, so we'll go straight to the question. The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Turn now to Group 5. This is on the interruption of limitation period, media complaints and expert determination. Can I call Amendment 3 in the name of Liam Kerr in a group on its own? Liam Kerr to move and speak to Amendment 3.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's another amendment which I brought but didn't press at Stage 2, but has been revised and improved for Stage 3. Section 33 currently makes provision for mediation, which is helpful and will pause limitation during that period. Now, several witnesses felt that this ought to be extended to other forms of dispute resolution, such as arbitration, expert determination, maybe press complaints or ombudsman bodies. So, this Amendment 3 provides that the limitation period of 1 year will not run during any period of time that parties engage in certain forms of alternative dispute resolution. These alternative methods are expert determination and a complaints process, such as press complaints or ombudsman complaints, which will be reflected, I understand, in the explanatory notes. So this is going to be achieved by the insertion of a new section into the bill. As part of the new section, I seek to define the two processes in subsection 4. Subsection 2 sets out to provide clarity as to when parties enter and exit such a dispute resolution process. Now, given that these processes are not necessarily structured or formal and the press complaints bodies are not defined in statute and so liable to change without providing a means to update the Act short of primary legislation, subsection 5 grants the Scottish Ministers power to amend the definitions found in subsection 4 to respond to future changes in the processes or types of bodies that handle media complaints. Any regulations made by Scottish Ministers are to be subject to the affirmative procedure as according to subsection 6. Now again, this amendment has benefited from the advice and assistance of the Minister and officials, for which I'm grateful, and I would be grateful similarly to earlier for Parliament's support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Kerr. No other member has indicated they wish to speak. Can I call the Minister, Ash Denham?
A number of members of this Parliament have, over a number of years, taken a keen interest in the methods of dispute resolution that don't involve a court. And the bill, as introduced, made provision for mediation in Section 33, and Mr Kerr's amendments extend the coverage of alternative methods of dispute resolution to include expert determination and media complaint processes. Now, given the nature of defamation, alternative forms of dispute resolution can be especially useful for resolving disputes, whether this is by way of mediation, arbitration, formal complaints processes or expert determination. And it seems only right that parties are not penalised for seeking to repair unfair damage without resorting to a court. And it also seems right that we give those same parties the time to pursue these options without the threat of time running out for raising court proceedings in actions of defamation and malicious publication. There is no need to force a party to lodge court proceedings in order to protect their legal rights solely because they are looking for other means to resolve a dispute. So I am grateful to Mr Kerr for agreeing to work with the Scottish Government on the definitions and drafting, and I believe that we have a robust provision that extends the ways that a defamation or a malicious publication dispute can be resolved without the same expense and weight involved in a court process. I'll be supporting this amendment, and I hope that members will join me.
Thank you very much, Minister. Does Mr Kerr wish to add anything?
Nothing to add other than to press the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr Kerr. So we'll go straight to the vote. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The last question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And that ends consideration of amendments. Now, as members will be aware, at this point in proceedings, I am required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in my view, any provision of the bill relates to a protected subject matter. That is, whether it modifies the electoral system or franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. In the case of this bill, in my view, it does no such thing. Therefore, it does not require a supermajority to be passed at stage 3. So we're going to move shortly on to the debate, but we'll just have a short pause before we do so. A short pause before we move on to the debate on the bill.
Thank you very much. The next item of business is indeed a debate on motion 24257 in the name of Ash Denham on the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill. Can I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Ash Denham to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be here today to open the debate on the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill. And I'd like to begin by thanking members of the Justice Committee and its clerks for their work on the bill. The bill is largely the outcome of work undertaken by the Scottish Law Commission, and it takes forward every substantive recommendation that it made. And I would like to thank the Commission for its valuable work on this. It's been mentioned here already today, but it's important to reiterate why the law of defamation is significant. And the law deals with two competing fundamental human rights: freedom of expression and protection of reputation. And we as lawmakers have to find an appropriate balance between the two, and I believe that the bill gets this balance right. Overall, the aim has been to make sure that our law of defamation is fit for the 21st century, with a clear and accessible framework that balances these two rights. The bill updates defamation law and simplifies it in some key areas, replacing and restating the existing law. One important reform is that before a successful defamation action can be raised, a damaging statement must be published to someone other than the person who is the subject of it. Defamation law should be about protecting reputation, but as the law currently stands, it protects more than this. If we are to say that freedom of expression is to be restricted in order to protect reputation, then it's vital to make sure that defamation law is not overextended to protect other interests. The threshold test of serious harm has been greatly discussed at all stages as this bill has progressed through the Parliament, and this test will give much needed confidence to those who have been told that they have published a defamatory statement. Scottish Pen described the threshold test as critical to the heart of the bill, that courts should not be asked to settle defamation litigation where there is little or no harm caused to individual reputation. The consequences for freedom of expression in such a situation should not be underestimated. Section 2 of the bill places on a statutory footing the common law principle that public authorities cannot raise defamation litigation. A public authority should use the ballot box to protect its reputation, not defamation law. There has been no decided case on whether the principle applies in Scotland, although legal professionals work on the assumption that it does. And this section, if Parliament agrees, puts that beyond doubt. The approach taken on secondary publishers will help to make sure that defamation law is focused on the source of a defamatory statement. Under the present law, secondary publishers are not actively responsible for the content they host, but they can be held liable. And we have heard how this liability can lead to secondary publishers taking a cautious approach to content. The law as it stands encourages secondary publishers to remove content, thereby interfering in the exercise of an individual's free expression. Ultimately, this should be a matter for the court to determine and not secondary publishers. Another significant aspect of the bill is that it brings together the main defences to a defamation action. The Scottish Government has taken this opportunity to reform the defences where necessary. For instance, the defence of honest opinion. One innovative change has been to extend the need to show that facts underpinning the opinion to be either true, privileged or reasonably believed to be true. Having the defences of truth, honest opinion and publication on the matter of public interest all set out in one place will help defenders better understand the law rather than leaving the defences uncodified. In a defamation action, the usual remedy sought and granted by a court is an award of damages. But this bill will widen the range of remedies available to those whose reputation has been unfairly damaged. A pursuer will be able to ask a court to remove or to affix a notice to a defamatory statement, ask to make a statement in court, or ask that a summary of the court's judgment is published. Ultimately, for most, the purpose of a defamation court action is to vindicate unfairly damaged reputation, and having new types of remedy that can achieve this is a welcome reform. And finally, I'd like to briefly mention the equally important reforms to the law of malicious publication brought about by this bill. The Scottish Law Commission gave a great deal of consideration to the common law actions of verbal injury and the new statutory cause of action of malicious publication, which replaces it. The law treats malicious publication actions differently from actions on defamation. In a malicious publication, the law does not presume that the statement complained about is one of fact, that it is false, or even that it was made with malice. Each of these elements must be proved by the pursuer, and in particular, the test of malice has been strengthened as the bill progressed, and I'd like to thank the Justice Committee for its work on this. In the end, malicious publication actions fill a gap in the law that would be left open if defamation was left as the only actionable form of wrong. The law of defamation in Scotland is due for reform. The last substantive changes were made more than a generation ago, and it's no longer fit for purpose. But any reform must find a balance between the two competing rights at the centre of any defamation action: the right to protection of reputation and the right to freedom of expression. And I believe that this bill achieves a more appropriate balance. Throughout the bill process, I've listened to the views of others across the chamber. There have been a number of amendments that the Scottish Government have either made in response to concerns or else supported after collaborative work with individual MSPs. And if agreed to by this Parliament, the reforms brought about by this bill will modernise and simplify our laws of defamation and malicious publication. So, Presiding Officer, I move that the Parliament agrees that the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill be passed.
Thank you very much, Minister. And I now call on Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I said during the Stage 1 debate into this bill that large parts of my week at the moment are set aside for reading, questioning and commenting on freedom of speech. Now, that hasn't changed since that debate, and indeed nor should it, as of course freedom of expression is and remains one of our most important fundamental rights with which we interfere at our peril. In these times when technological developments and social media have allowed pretty much anyone to be a publisher, it is imperative both that free speech is protected and any threats caused to it by laws are avoided. However, as this bill acknowledges, there is also the perhaps sometimes competing right to protect one's reputation. And it is striking the balance between these two rights that this bill seeks to achieve. Now, there is no doubt that striking that balance is not straightforward, which is something the Scottish Law Commission recognised as they sought to put Scots law of defamation on a statutory footing fit for the 21st century. As the Minister set out, this bill seeks to implement the substantive recommendations of the SLC's report, particularly insofar as it recommended changes to the common law rules for verbal injury, a change in the presumption for trial by jury for defamation cases, and that public authorities should not be able to initiate defamation proceedings. Many more recommendations were made and appear in the Defamation Bill. It is the view of the Scottish Conservatives that the Defamation and Malicious Publications Bill broadly achieves the balance required, and therefore will vote in favour at decision time tonight. Now, whilst that balance is achieved, as Adam Tompkins said earlier, I think it's fair to say it does shift the balance towards freedom of speech, insofar as it introduces a serious harm to the pursuer's reputation test. That is to say, for a defamation action to succeed, a pursuer will have to show not merely harm, but serious harm to their reputation. And there's been a very interesting debate around this test, and it's possibly the most contentious aspect of this bill. The test was introduced, according to the policy memorandum, which itself picks up on the Scottish Law Commission's work, because of a lack of authority in Scots common law and the inability of Scottish courts to dispose of trivial claims at an early stage. It also brings Scots law into line with the position in England and Wales, leading some in the committee's evidence-taking to suggest this is an English solution to an English problem. Now, I find these arguments interesting because it does seem to me that if there's a lack of authority, then arguably the Law Society have a point, that if an extra hurdle is brought in, it could deter claims and thus lead to even less such authority developing. And whilst ensuring the ability to dispose of trivial claims feels like the right thing to do, the Faculty of Advocates suggested that there is no reason to think that Scottish courts have thus far been troubled by such trivial claims. But I listened carefully to the media respondents in particular, who said that a serious harm test adds clarity, prevents cases without merit going forward, and crucially, gives them reassurance in publication to avoid a chilling effect. And it's this final point which I find particularly persuasive. So whilst I see merit in both sides of the debate, and I'm pleased that all views have been heard and considered, on balance I align with the committee's view, and I think the Parliament's view, which was to favour retention of the serious harm test. Now, I was also exercised somewhat by the sections on malicious publication, which I felt throughout hadn't been given quite the same level of attention as perhaps others were. I was concerned principally about the definition of malice, the applicability of defences, and a de minimis level of damage akin to the serious harm test. And I've been satisfied on all of those, with the Minister acknowledging my concerns and either working with me to amend the definition to ensure that any statement must be both false and malicious to be defamatory, or she and her officials engaging in challenging yet constructive debate with me on the merits or otherwise of my amendments. On that point, incidentally, I do think it right and proper to acknowledge the Minister and her officials' approach to this bill, because at least when dealing with me, certainly this has been respectful, constructive and productive throughout. Now, I did have other concerns, principally around limitation and observing other colleagues' challenges, but I can see that concerns raised with stakeholders have been, for the most part, addressed either at stage 2 or earlier today. Indeed, on that limitation concern, I am content that my amendment was passed earlier today, ensuring that not only will mediation stop the clock, but other specific forms of conciliation could do so. For which reason, it is my view that this bill strikes the right balance between freedom of expression and protection of individual reputations. And accordingly, the Scottish Conservatives will vote to pass the bill at decision time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Neil Bibby to be followed by John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start by taking this opportunity to thank the Scottish Law Commission for all the work they have done on this bill, and I also like to pay tribute to the members of the Justice Committee for all their scrutiny on the bill to ensure that defamation law in Scotland is fit for the 21st century. As all members this afternoon have said this afternoon, it is important that with this legislation we strike the proper balance between the freedom of expression and the protection of one's reputation, something that hasn't always been the case in Scotland's defamation laws. By modernising defamation law and placing it on statute rather than relying on common law, we ensure that the law is accessible and that the requirements on an individual's speech with regards to defamation are made clear. However, by placing the definition of defamation on statute, we must ensure that the ability of the courts to continue to develop the law through case law is not stifled. And of course, in this digital age with more and more publications online, technology and communication methods will continue to evolve and develop, and so must defamation law too, to ensure it remains fit for purpose. I welcome the assurances that have been given by the Scottish Government to address this and the other changes the Minister has made to address other concerns and issues throughout the passage of the bill. I'm aware that there has been much discussion throughout the course of this bill on the introduction of the serious harm test, which is a significant change to the current law on defamation, but one which is similar to the change in legislation in England and Wales in the 2013 Act. As I said previously, we do need to ensure that we strike the proper balance between freedom of expression and the protection of one's reputation. As it stands, current defamation laws can have a chilling effect on media scrutiny and freedom of speech, as those with sufficient resources can bring vexatious cases and make litigation threats. We do need to prevent vexatious cases being brought forward. However, recognise concerns that a serious harm test takes us past that point. The amendments put forward by Andy Whiteman to counteract the chilling effect were unsuccessful, but for the record, Scottish Labour did support those amendments. This legislation also codifies the Derbyshire principle onto the statute, whereby public bodies cannot bring defamation actions, and I noted that in stage 2, further clarity was added to the bill on what bodies would be caught under the definition of a public authority. Scottish Labour, however, believe that this did not go far enough and are disappointed that proposals to bring private and charitable organisations who deliver public services should be included within the Derbyshire principles that were not supported by the Government or the Justice Committee. In such cases, it is vital that the public interest defence be rigorously applied to ensure that this does not add to the chilling effect in discussions or criticism public activities being administered by private bodies. Scottish Labour also believe that actions available to the courts prior to a case being decided must be proportionate. That is why we supported the amendments from Fulton McGregor, which removed the powers afforded by this bill for courts to order that material subject to legal proceedings be removed. This would instead be replaced with the ability to attach a prominent notice to such materials or publications identifying that is a subject to legal action. Presiding Officer, in closing, this bill is necessary to modernise Scotland's defamation laws and make them fit for purpose. This bill can also rebalance the law to limit the chilling effect and promote freedom of expression. Scottish Labour can and will therefore support this bill at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on John Finney to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And at this stage, it's appropriate that I join others in thanking those who have brought us to this point. The Scottish Law Commission, and we've heard that every one of their substantive recommendations was taken forward, and the Justice Committee met with them, and can I thank them for their work, not just in this, but in relation to other matters too. Can also give a personal thanks to the Minister and her officials. The manner of engagement, which others have referred to, I can personally vouch for. I had meetings with the Minister along with Mr Whiteman, and whilst our meetings didn't quite bring the result that others have, differing views were genuinely held, and I thank the Minister for the way she's gone about that, and it's evident that it's quite improvement. And also thank the committee and parliamentary staff who worked tirelessly for us, and the witnesses both in person and in writing, and indeed all those who provided briefings. I don't think anyone would dispute that this legislation has had detailed scrutiny. We've had some very good debate, and everyone entered it with the same goal, and that was to make good legislation. I reflect on the SPICE briefing, which was one of the initial papers we had, and the pivotal issue that's been referred throughout this and will continue to be the balancing of rights. And there was a note in there that I thought it was worthy of repeating, and that was, and I quote here, Scots law was grappling with issues around freedom of expression, individual privacy and protection of reputation well before human rights came into the frame. However, the requirement to uphold the rights contained in the European Convention on Human Rights brought an additional dimension into this balancing act. And of course, we know, presiding officer, that we can only pass legislation that's compatible with the Convention. And like many things, and most legislation, this has been about striking this balance between competing factors. The appropriate balance between the right to freedom of expression contained in Article 10 and the right to respect private life in Article 8. And it's the conclusion of the Scottish Green Party that balance has been struck, and for that reason we will be supporting the legislation at decision time tonight. Now, the balance, that particular balance, is not unique to this bill. The Justice Committee is presently wrestling with the reality of reflecting both these important rights, freedom of expression and the right to respect for private life, in the hate crime bill, where both these issues are starkly at play. And we read the quote, the right to freedom of expression protects the right to hold and exchange information and opinions. And to state the obvious, this isn't new law. This is moving to a statutory definition, clarifying the law, because as one of our briefings said, much of the current law is obscure and based on judges' decisions in previous cases. So the bill aims to make the law easier to understand. We'll see with that. A lot of people have difficulty with understanding the law. Strengthens existing defences and in relation to publication in the public interest. Now, we debated again thresholds today and the change from there being in the bill from being no express harm threshold in the law to a serious harm to reputation being needed. And I think it's worthy of noting that the Law Society, perhaps for different reasons from myself, continue to have reservations about that element. And it's also very clear that much of law is opinion, even emphasis and perceptions rather than fact. And we saw that in discussions around Mr. Whiteman's amendment. And I say again, differing views genuinely held. Another parallel with the hate crime bill is the issue of the potential chilling effect. And the consensus the committee had, the bill alters the balance of freedom of speech. It alters the balance of this debate in favour of freedom of speech. And I think that's important in a vibrant democracy. The common law largely focused on print publications, and some rules don't readily transfer. So I think we saw a very good amendment from Mr. Kerr covering that, future-proofing, that much-used phrase, both in terms of how information is processed, and I think importantly acknowledging that these could be important decisions worthy of the widest possible discussion, and therefore putting it on the affirmative procedure. The comment that the statement complained of must have been published to a person rather than simply the one who's subject to the statement, that is an improvement, and that's to be welcomed. I think there are a number of important features in this that are to be welcomed. The Minister will know that I rambled long and hard about the Derbyshire principle and my concerns that with so many of our public services delivered by private organisations, that we don't have a level playing field. We don't have that. We don't have that in relation to the huge sums of money that go out in respect of ferry services, CalMac, the public provider, versus Serco, and the time frame, because one of the elements was delivering services from time to time. Well, when you're talking about a 15-year contract, where is the political accountability in that? And importantly, I want to point out that the Court of Session held that Serco, which had been contracted to provide housing to asylum seekers, was not a public authority. I commend references to alternative dispute resolution. I think it's very important. We've spent a lot of time putting laws in place. In an ideal world, we don't want to see them put into practice. We want people to find other methods of doing that. So references to alternative dispute resolution, to my mind, are always welcome. Can I thank the Minister for engagement? Can I thank colleagues for working on this? I think we've got a good piece of legislation. And as I said previously, a decision time tonight, the party will be supported. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much. Can I start by warmly welcoming Neil Bibby to his new role? I don't know whether we could look forward to seeing him at the next and probably the last Justice Committee meeting of this session, but I wish him well in his new role. Deputy Presiding Officer, as well as confirming Scottish Liberal Democrat support for this bill, can I add my thanks to all those who helped the Justice Committee in our scrutiny of it, and in particular, I think, as others have said, the Scottish Law Commission, who I think bear greatest responsibility for development of these proposals. This is a very technical area of the law, showing an area which isn't, but one that was overdue for updating and codifying, not least to help make it more accessible to those who might have reason to use it. Even though the government's intention was to update and codify, however, as others have observed, the government's also taken the opportunity to reset the balance, however modestly, between protecting reputation on the one hand and freedom of speech on the other. By our own admission, the Minister recognised that the scales are being tipped slightly more in favour of freedom of speech. We had calls and evidence for more radical moves in that direction from witnesses concerned about the so-called chilling effect caused by legal threats from those with so-called thin skins and thick wallets. On the other side, there were appeals against what was seen as an erosion of privacy rights in an attempt to impose English solutions to an English problem in terms of defamation. As I said at stage one, however, I think the government has broadly got the balance right, though on a personal level, I'm very grateful to Andy Whiteman for his contribution on the question of the serious harm threshold. Having lived experience of the law of defamation, Mr Whiteman's insights were both interesting and helpful, even if ultimately his argument for setting the threshold and actual harm proved unsuccessful earlier on this afternoon. The bill sensibly includes a statutory definition of defamation as well as a codification of potential defences, both of which are welcome developments that should aid accessibility. However, as the committee rightly made clear, it will be important that these and other relevant aspects of the bill allow sufficient flexibility to adapt over time and draw on case law. The committee also called for greater clarity around the way in which the Derbyshire principle was expressed, referred to there by John Finney, and it remains to be seen whether the bill was far enough in this regard. But I appreciate that some of the options considered by the committee could well have been unduly arbitrary and led to unintended and unwelcome consequences. Exclusion of secondary publishers from liability is another element of the bill worthy of support. And while I think we're right to resist attempts to amend the bill to allow effectively take-down notices prior to any evidence being heard, hopefully the modest changes agreed today, making clear that a statement is subject to proceedings, offer some reassurance and additional clarity. Finally, on the question of limitation, the reduction to 1 year for bringing a case is the right move, particularly in a digital age. While there will be instances where the court will be able still to exercise discretion, and mediation or other forms of dispute resolution can and should be encouraged, again, as John Finney rightly pointed out. This change to limitation should help address another area where chilling occurs through the mere threat of legal action. Deputy Presiding Officer, this bill will be judged on the basis of its success in striking an appropriate balance between the rights of protecting reputation and freedom of expression. I believe it gets that balance just about right. I commend the Minister and our officials for the way that they've gone about engaging with the committee and stakeholders on this bill. And on that basis, Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting it at decision time shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we now call the one speaker in the open debate, Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill, which will hopefully be passed today, is absolutely vital to ensure that the law of defamation is fit for 21st century Scotland. Can I thank the Scottish Law Commission, all our witnesses who gave evidence, and the excellent clerking and bill team who managed to make a somewhat technical bill more easy to understand for members of the Justice Committee. Presiding Officer, today's fast-changing and wide-ranging methods of communication demand a clear and accessible framework that more appropriately balances the protection of individual reputation and freedom of expression. Throughout our scrutiny of the bill, we heard that complex and costly defamation litigation can lead to a chilling effect on freedom of expression, whereby people are discouraged from publishing because they fear the threat of legal action. The widespread use of social media, blog posts and so-called citizen journalists means that defamation law doesn't just affect big media companies. It's become easier to spread unsubstantiated rumours or to deliberately damage someone's reputation. And this has put website operators on the front line of the battle over freedom of expression. We took evidence from individuals, media companies, legal stakeholders and content creators who were extremely helpful in outlining their experience of defamation law. There's no doubt that the existing law is patchy, goes back decades and doesn't strike the right balance between freedom of speech and protection of reputation, particularly with regard to online publication. The most recent legislative changes occurred in 2013 and before that in 1996. Presiding Officer, like others, can I thank the Minister for working collaboratively with all committee members and stakeholders to reach consensus on this bill. There were some areas of contention raised during evidence sessions, particularly in relation to public defences, raising the threshold for bringing defamation actions, the serious harm test, single publication rule and a one-year time limit to raising court action. The amendments passed today should give confidence to publishers that only cases where real harm has been done to an individual's reputation will litigation be allowed to proceed in our courts. Presiding Officer, it's vital to take account of the changing landscape in publishing. Traditional journalists, which I was one, undergo training and editors have access to legal advice, but this is rarely the case for those publishing online. Defamation law has been developed with a focus in print publications and some of the rules are difficult to adapt to online publication. The bill seeks to address concerns in that area by increasing protection to internet intermediaries who are secondary publishers. The bill makes provision for the courts to require a website to remove content and to require other people or bodies to stop distributing or showing material. And my colleague Fulton McGregor's amendments are very helpful in this area. Presiding Officer, it's impossible to fully future-proof the law in this area due to the ever-changing nature of technology, and that's why Liam Kerr's amendments were so helpful in this regard. The bill also prohibits public bodies from raising a defamation action. John Finney has just been outlining. It's vitally important that a public body such as local authorities, the Scottish Parliament, Scottish ministers, etc., should be open to public scrutiny and uninhibited criticism. But this is not because a public body doesn't have a reputation or is beyond scrutiny. It's because defamation law is not the appropriate way to defend that reputation. As the Minister said, this should be done at the ballot box. Private bodies, of course, can't do this, so it's only right that we don't prohibit them from raising defamation actions. But this doesn't mean the bill fails to protect those who criticise and scrutinise these companies. They'll be able to rely on the new defence of publication on a matter of public interest, the reformed defence of honest opinion and the serious harm threshold test to protect their legitimate speech. Presiding Officer, when someone suffers serious harm to their reputation, they usually should know this soon after a defamatory statement is published. This is why the bill reduces to 1 year the time limit in which legal action can be raised. In this day and age, it's no longer appropriate to have the limitation clock begin again each and every time an article is downloaded or accessed online. It's just not practical. We know that the current length of the limitation period can be used to chill freedom of expression, and we heard evidence of this during our scrutiny. It can be used to discourage investigative journalists where the fear or threat that defamation proceedings could be raised many years down the road, and that blocks free expression. It's not to say that the 1 year limit is absolute, because there is flexibility in the bill that can take into account any subsequent publication to disapply the time limit where to do so. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I warmly welcome this bill and commend everyone who had a part in shaping it. I believe it does strike the right balance between freedom of expression and protecting an individual reputation, and I urge the Chamber to pass it at stage 3. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on James Kelly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and as others have done, can I thank the Justice Committee for the work that they've done in this bill. I'm very aware as a former member of the committee as to the workload that the Justice Committee has taken on in the recent period. particularly the hate crime legislation, and it's to their credit that we've been able to take this legislation through and make some improvements to it as it's moved to stage 3. I also think it's important to recognise the role of the Scottish Law Commission. They brought forward the report that showed the need for legislation in this area. As Liam MacArthur said, this will be seen by some as quite a technical bill. However, it's very, very much needed. The law needed to be made more up to date and modern. I think the changes that were made in England and Wales helpful in that legislature, and I think it was useful to learn from that experience. I think throughout the discussion on the bill, there's been this kind of two kind of pulling forces, if you like. It's clearly important to defend freedom of speech. However, that must be important not to campaign into an area where people are defamatory, and that is unacceptable, and there should be legal provisions in place to ensure that those who are defamed are able to take appropriate action in the courts. And I think what happened in terms of the government's progress with the bill and also the committee consideration of the bill is on the various issues they've kind of tussled with this freedom of speech versus not allowing people to defame. And I think broadly they've got it right. So for example, on issues like the serious harm test, the bill is drafted and then the changes that were made that ensures that the balance is correct on that. Although I do say that, I agree with Liam MacArthur in terms of changes that Andy Whiteman brought forward, I think would have brought further clarity to the law. As ever, Mr. Whiteman interacted, very kind of seriously with this legislation and with the committee. He brings a lot of experience to it, and he brings a lot of experience to other areas of legislation in the Parliament. And I want to put on record that he's a highly respected MSP across all parties. I think the changes that have been made, and one of the issues that was discussed through time was the right appropriate defences. And I think it is important to codify that in law, and allowing people to have a defence of honest opinion or the public interest was correct. I do share Neil Bibby's concern in relation to the Derbyshire principle that public bodies who operate in a charitable environment should have been subject to that principle, and it's regrettable that those changes weren't accepted at stage 2. However, in summing up, Deputy Presiding Officer, I think this piece of legislation adds to the toolkit, particularly in the social media age, of giving appropriate protection to people who are defamed, to ensure that it's easier as a result of this legislation to bring action through the courts. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I now call Adam Tompkins.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. So as we've heard, this bill, which originated in the work of the Scottish Law Commission, puts the Scots law of defamation on a statutory footing that really is fit for the 21st century. And in doing so, again, as we've heard, it addresses and balances two competing rights: the right to freedom of expression on the one hand, and the right to protect one's reputation, often seen as an aspect of the right to privacy, on the other. Taken as a whole, this bill gets that balance right. It does so by shifting, perhaps only subtly shifting, but nonetheless shifting the balance that we have in the current law. And the bill shifts the balance in favour of freedom of speech. So it says, for example, we debated this earlier this afternoon, that for a defamation action to succeed, a pursuer will have to show not merely harm, but serious harm to their reputation. And it says also that defamation actions will generally have to be commenced within 1 year rather than within the current 3-year period of the harm occurring. Now, some commentators have expressed concerns about this shift in favour of greater freedom of speech, but most have welcomed it. And in particular, and unsurprisingly, I suppose, media organisations have welcomed it strongly. It addresses the chilling effect, they have said, which the current law of defamation can sometimes cast over journalists, publishers and writers when actions are brought or indeed even threatened by pursuers. Now, I have to say, Presiding Officer, that I very much welcome this shift in favour of free speech. Free speech matters now as much as ever, and we can never take it for granted, and we must always be on our guard to protect it. It matters for democracy, it matters for anyone who cares about the truth, and it matters too, of course, for individual self-fulfilment and liberty. Free speech acts as a brake on the abuse of power by public officials. It facilitates the exposure of errors in government, and it is an essential condition of an intellectually healthy society. So I'm glad to support any bill that advances freedom of speech, however subtly as this bill does. And likewise, any bill that threatens free speech would be one I would want to scrutinise very carefully indeed. We may come back to some of these points next week, Presiding Officer, when we debate once again the notorious hate crime bill. And I'm not the only one this afternoon to have drawn parallels between the defamation bill and the hate crime bill. Now, because of the admirable work of the Law Commission, the defamation bill has not needed a great deal of amendment as it has progressed through its legislative stages. One area that was improved at stage 2 is the so-called Derbyshire principle, named after an English case decided by the House of Lords in the early 1990s. This is the principle, of course, that local authorities may not sue in defamation. If you are an elected official, the place where you seek to protect your reputation is in the ballot box, not in the defamation courts. As Lord Keith said in this case, and I quote, "It's of the highest public importance that a democratically elected governmental body, or indeed any governmental body, should be open to uninhibited public criticism," unquote. And the bill puts this principle, which is a judge-made rule of the common law, on a statutory footing. As originally drafted, there were some concerns about how this was proposed to be done in the bill. In particular, the question was whether private bodies that are carrying out functions of a public nature should also be barred, as local authorities are, from suing in defamation. And I'm pleased that this issue was fixed at stage 2 and indeed has not needed to be revisited at stage 3 this afternoon by incorporating into this bill the same basic approach to the question of the scope of public authorities that we find in the Human Rights Act. That's a good solution, it's a workable solution, and I think it will make sense in the context of this bill. Let me close, Presiding Officer, with this final point. Placing the modern law of defamation on a statutory footing should aid the accessibility of the law, but should in no sense freeze its ongoing development in the case law of the courts. The single most important and liberalising reform to defamation in recent years, the creation of the new Defence of Publication in the Public Interest in the Reynolds case, came, of course, in case law and not in statute. So I welcome this bill and I support it. I will support it at decision time this evening, and I do so in both the hope and the expectation that it will assist the courts as the law of defamation and malicious publication continues to be developed by them. This is a really good bill, Presiding Officer. It makes welcome and valuable changes to Scots law. And I thank the Law Commission, the Minister, and all my colleagues on the Justice Committee for all of their work on it. And I look forward to voting for this bill in a few minutes' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Ash Denham to wind up the debate. Generous 6 minutes, Minister.
Okay. Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I want to begin by thanking everyone today for their contribution to the debate. And I've listened to what has been said, and I welcome the general support that's been given across the Chamber for the aims of the bill. And in closing, I want to touch briefly on some of the provisions that we've discussed. So reputation plays an important part in informing many of our day-to-day decisions. And so, in my view, it's helpful to have a simple and clear definition of what defamation is. The definition is a simple restatement, but in the modern language, of the common law test, which is now 85 years old. And it's a restatement of the current law and not a departure from it. Now, the serious harm threshold has been the subject of quite a bit of debate as this bill has progressed. I think it came up at stage 1, 2 and now at stage 3. Some say that it's a solution to a problem that doesn't exist in Scotland and it will deter legitimate claims. Measuring the issue on the number of cases, though, that proceed to court, I think is to miss the problem. And the possibility of litigation deters legitimate speech. And during evidence, a number of stakeholders gave as examples their direct experiences. And the law of defamation places a considerable burden on an author, on an editor or a publisher to defend what they have published. And if Parliament agrees, the serious harm test will shift part of that burden back towards the pursuer, who will, in relevant circumstances, have to prove a minimum level of damage to their reputation. And this is, to my mind, a more appropriate balance than the current law allows for. So, as mentioned by Liam Kerr and Neil Bibby in their contributions, importantly, it avoids that chilling effect that we've heard about through some of the submissions to the committee in the early stages of the bills proceeding through the Parliament. And the threshold of serious harm means that the people of Scotland will have the same level of protection for freedom of expression as those in England and Wales currently do. On the so-called Derbyshire principle, which came up this afternoon during the debate, John Finney, I note the comments that he made on this. The bill was, of course, amended at stage 2 to add additional clarity on the Derbyshire principle, and that was set out quite well, I think, by Adam Tompkins in his contribution this afternoon. Some people in the chamber have mentioned that private companies delivering public services should be prohibited from raising defamation actions. And this argument is because public authorities are prohibited, so should those companies who take public money. But public authorities are not prohibited from raising an action under this section because they are in charge of public money. They're prohibited because in a democratic system, the ballot box is the appropriate place for its reputation to be evaluated and, where appropriate, repaired. And a private company cannot use the ballot box to repair damage to its reputation. So we should not remove rights as currently enjoyed by a company or indeed by a charity, as was raised by Neil Bibby in his contribution, simply because it chooses to contract with a public authority. But this is not to say that the bill does not offer enhanced protections for those who wish to criticise the private delivery of public services. The bill sets out the threshold test of serious harm, as we've discussed, the defences of honest opinion and publication on a matter of public interest, and the reduced limitation period, as mentioned by Rona Mackay in her contribution this afternoon, and the single publication rule. And all of these provisions will in some way help. John Finney and Adam Tompkins also noted that delicate balancing act required between the two competing rights represented in the Articles 8 and Article 10. And I'm very pleased to hear this afternoon that the Parliament believes that the correct balance has been struck here. Other provisions that have been discussed and are worth mentioning in brief are provisions to encourage the use of alternative methods of dispute resolution, the wider range of remedies available to restore damaged reputation, and the provisions on malicious publication that are the result of the substantial work undertaken by the Scottish Law Commission. And I'd like to thank once again the Scottish Law Commission for the time and effort that it put into reviewing the current law of defamation and verbal injury, for its significant consultation work and for its final recommendation. And the bill, I think, is a reflection of those efforts. So defamation law in Scotland dates back for over 100 years. And the Scottish Law Commission noted two cases in its discussion paper, and that was the case of the Duke of Brunswick versus Harmer, and that was in 1849, which was the year that the Buchanan Street railway station was first opened. And another case of McKellar versus Duke of Sutherland, and that was in 1859. Then one of the leading cases in Scots law was Mackay versus McCankie, and that was in 1883. And that case held that the defamation can arise if an imputation is communicated merely to the person who is the subject of it. And around about that time, telephones were just starting to be used. The last time that the law was substantively updated was in 1996, and that is a year that I do remember. The internet was just getting going. It was in its early stages. I still didn't have a mobile phone. I obviously wasn't an early adopter. I got one for the first time a year later than that. There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter, and people, I remember, seemed to spend a lot of time sending faxes. With the development and widespread use of modern technology, defamation law now has the potential to impact a far greater number of people than even a generation ago. And it's no longer only the media who are likely to be affected. Individuals can now create content with their phone, and social media has fundamentally changed the way that we communicate with each other. The 21st century and the technological developments within it require us to respond to that changing nature of our communication. And so the bill creates a clear and accessible framework that reflects that reality of modern Scotland, introducing effective remedies for protecting reputation and stronger protections for freedom of expression. So, Presiding Officer, I commend the motion in my name.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate on the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill, and we will move on shortly to the next item of business. The next item of business is a debate on motion 24177 in the name of Bill Kidd on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee on Code of Conduct rule changes, treatment of others. Can I invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Bill Kidd to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the report and the proposals contained in it to revise the Code of Conduct for MSPs represent a concluding step in the considerable work that has been undertaken by my committee and the Parliament as a whole to address sexual harassment and sexist behaviour. The Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee believes that members, as elected representatives, should be held to high standards of conduct under the Code. Accordingly, we altered the Code over a year ago to make it clear that members must not behave in a manner that involves bullying, harassment, including sexual harassment, or any other inappropriate behaviour towards one another or towards their own or other staff and contractors working in and for the Parliament. The change set out in this report will extend that standard of behaviour to others MSPs might come into contact with in their capacity as MSPs. It is right and only right that individuals such as government staff, constituents or cross-party group members, for example, have the same protection under the Code as SPCB staff and MSP staff. We consulted in this latest change and received very positive support, particularly from groups representing women's interests. I thank the Minister for Parliamentary Business for his supportive response to the consultation. The committee gave a great deal of thought to balancing this measure with members' rights to freedom on political expression, and I remind the Chamber that the Code does not interfere with members' private lives. The new standard of conduct towards these individuals will apply from the start of Session 6 and will have no retrospective effect. On behalf of the committee, I move the motion in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, and we will move on in a moment to the item of business.
Thank you, colleagues. The next item of business is consideration of Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body Motion 24232 on reimbursement of members' expenses scheme. Could I call on Liam MacArthur on behalf of the SPCB to speak to and move the motion?
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. On behalf of the corporate body, I move the motion to replace the current reimbursement of members' expenses scheme. We're making the change now in order that the new scheme is in place for the start of session 6. This new scheme is the result of two separate reviews, the first that looked at office costs and the other provisions within the scheme, the second that focused on staff costs. Presiding Officer, on behalf of the corporate body, you wrote to all members following these reviews earlier in this session, explaining the detail of the changes proposed. Members also had an opportunity to feed into the reviews, and I'm very grateful to those who helped us with our considerations. As colleagues will not need reminding, a strong Parliament depends on having members equipped to fulfil their role, both in representing their constituents and holding the government of the day to account. These changes ensure members continue to be properly supported in carrying out these important functions. If agreed, from the start of session 6, the staff cost provision limit will be increased to £133,200 per year. That will enable members to employ up to the equivalent of 4 full-time staff in a flexible way to suit individual office needs. The changes also include a new start-up provision, separate to the office cost provision, to help members set up their local office. The scheme will also be simplified by reducing the 4 current provisions, office cost, surgery advertising, telecommunications and members' stationery and postage, into 2 new provisions, an office cost provision and an engagement provision. More flexibility has also been given to members, allowing up to £5,000 to be flexed between these 2 new provisions. This recognises that members work in different ways. The corporate body also recognised that some additional support was needed in other areas. So, for example, the annual limit on staff travel of 74 journeys has been removed. Members with a disability or caring responsibilities who would normally fall into Group 2 of Edinburgh accommodation can now apply to the SPCB to be considered as falling into Group 3. Additional temporary resources can be applied for where a member is absent long term, and the winding up provision has been amended to recognise the support required when a member's status changes following an election, rather than only when a member ceases to be a member. I hope these brief comments are helpful to the Chamber, and on behalf of the corporate body, I move motion S5M 24232. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr MacArthur. And the question on this motion will also be taken at decision time. Now, we're running slightly ahead of schedule, but I am minded to accept a motion without notice under Rule 11.2.4 of Standing Orders that decision time be brought forward to now. Could I call on Graeme Day, the Minister, to move such a motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. So the question is that decision time is brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. So there are 3 questions this evening. The first question is that, now before we move to the question, because I'm going to put this question, because it's an act of Parliament, members will have to vote, I'm going to ask all members to refresh their app. So this is including members who have voted previously. I'm going to ask all members to refresh their app. In fact, what I'll do is I'll have a short suspension. That's probably the best thing to do. I'm going to have a short suspension because there might be some members who didn't vote in the bill earlier who will just be joining us. So I'm going to have a short suspension, allow members to access the app who haven't, and those who already did to refresh the app. So a short suspension. We'll be back in a few moments. Thank you, colleagues. We are now back in session. So we're going to move straight to the vote. And the question is that motion 24257, in the name of Ash Denham, on the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill at Stage 3 be agreed. This will be a 1-minute division. Members may cast their votes now.
Yes. I've been vaccinated when I was neither up nor down. My wife got it, she was up for a day. Yes, I was perfect.
That vote is now closed. Please let me know if you were not able to vote. Thank you, colleagues. The result of the vote on motion 24257 in the name of Ash Denham is yes 118. There were no votes against, there were no abstentions. The motion is agreed and the Defamation and Malicious Publication Scotland Bill is passed. The next question is that motion 24177 in the name of Bill Kidd on behalf of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee on Code of Conduct rule changes, treatment of others be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the final question is that motion 24232 in the name of Liam MacArthur on behalf of the Scottish Parliamentary Corporate Body on reimbursement of members' expenses scheme be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. That concludes decision time. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Rona Mackay on Eating Disorder Awareness Week, but we'll just take a short pause while members change seats. I would encourage all members to observe social distancing rules, wear their masks and follow the one-way systems when leaving the chamber. Thank you.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.